Okay, good evening, everybody. We're going to convene the, I guess I was going to say a normal meeting, but a business meeting of the Boulder City Council on August 1st, 2017. Lynette, call the roll, please.
Councilmember Applebaum?
Here.
Brockett?
Here.
Burton?
Here.
Jones?
Here.
Morzell? Shoemaker? Weaver?
Here.
Yates? Young? Here. We have a quorum.
Excellent, and we're starting a couple hours later tonight because we did something different, which was actually really fun, and it was called National Night Out, which is, my understanding of National Night Out is it was an invitation for neighborhoods throughout our city to convene and host, basically have potlucks and parties, and members of council and also our police department and fire department went around to the different gatherings to meet folks and have conversation and let kids play all over the fire trucks. I'd like to say that we were the highlight, but we were not. It was definitely the fire trucks. But a lot of really good connections, and I think that was really worthwhile. So because of that, we're skipping open comment and we're getting right to business tonight. And we're going to start with a special proclamation that Councilman Weaver is going to do.
Hi there. Hello.
It's on.
You can hear it? Great. So I'm here tonight to read a proclamation in honor of the 40th anniversary of the Pearl Street Mall, and I would like to invite up the people who are here to receive the proclamation: Bing Chow, Jerry Shapins, Susan Conley, and Lane Landreth. You want to come up and I'll read this. So, honoring the 40th anniversary of the Pearl Street Mall, on August 6, 1977, the Pearl Street Mall was dedicated to be used as a park, special event space, meeting place, and commercial venue, and has become the center of our community. The City of Boulder and the downtown community partnered in the creation of the original mall and continue to work in collaboration to ensure its success. The Pearl Street Mall is recognized as one of the premier outdoor pedestrian gathering and retail spaces in the United States. The American Planning Association named the Pearl Street Mall as one of the 6 great public spaces on the organization's annual Great Places in America list for 2015. On August 9th, the community will come together once again to celebrate the Pearl Street Mall's 40th anniversary, thereby continuing dedication of the Pearl Street Mall as the heart of our city and gathering place for all to express commitment and affection to our hometown. The community is invited to attend the events scheduled throughout the week, including Band on the Bricks, 40 Years on Pearl Street, social media, photo sharing, Pearl Street Mile community foot race, and downtown Boulder sidewalk races. The City Council of the City of Boulder, Colorado declares August 9th, 2017 as the 40th anniversary of the Pearl Street Mall and call upon the people of the City of Boulder to join their fellow residents in celebrating our community landmark. Hey.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bing Chu. I've been lucky enough to have joined the board of the Downtown Boulder Partnership a few years ago, and now find myself standing in front of all you folks to represent several decades of very hard work from quite a few different community members. So thank you very much for the proclamation and the recognition. It's an honor to be here.
I'm Jerry Shapins. I'm on the Downtown Management Commission, and we have a great collaborative relationship with all the downtown stakeholders and the city at large, and it's just delightful that we celebrate the win-win-win-win-win of the Pearl Street Mall. Thank you so much.
I would say we have a copy of a beautiful 40th anniversary of the mall poster for each of the council members. I'll leave it with the city clerk.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you know a place we could frame that?
She wants to know, do you know a place we could frame that? Thank you. All right, thank you for that, Sam. The second special thing we're doing tonight is a presentation by Professor Friedrich regarding our comprehensive annual financial report. And you've been doing this year after year after year. I don't know how we can thank you enough for all the work you do.
Oh, thank you. I'm David, and I'm presenting on behalf of the City of Boulder's Audit Committee. We're bringing forth for your consideration motions to consider 2 resolutions to accept the City of Boulder's annual financial report and the auditor's report thereon, and the second resolution to appoint Clifton Larson Allen to be the external auditors for the 2017 audit. Broadly, we have oversight responsibility for the financial reporting part of the city. We also are the safe haven for the external auditors if an issue ever so arose. In my time, none has. The current committee is made up of council members Burton, Shoemaker, Weaver, and myself. We may, the City of Boulder's Audit Committee, be the least visible committee that the city has, but in my time, I have never seen a team member, current, or some of you who served in the past, ever treated as such. The first resolution also is kind of presented on behalf of the city manager and the finance department, as they are the ones that prepare the comprehensive annual financial report. Me being an outsider, I also need to give shout outs to Cheryl Patelli, Chief Financial Officer, Ann Penny, Controller, and Ron Gilbert, Assistant Controller, because without them always being available to answer my questions, to inform, to give me a heads up, I would be not in the position I am now with regard to knowledge. City of Boulder prepares these comprehensive annual financial reports. The finance department prepares them. The external auditor's only responsibility is to express an opinion on these financial reports as to whether they present fairly or not. The current year's financial reports, in the opinion of the external auditors, do present fairly. They gave what is colloquially known a clean opinion. That's the highest that any entity can be given, that your financial statements present fairly in all material respects. In addition, the external auditors communicate with the audit committee regarding any findings that they have throughout the year. They don't express an opinion on the internal controls, the policies, procedures that produce the financial reports, but if they see something, they communicate it to the audit committee in 3 buckets. In one bucket is if they identify a material weakness. Those are deficiencies so severe that the annual report, the financials, are probably not presenting fairly. The City of Boulder has 0 material weaknesses. On the other end, they present best practice recommendations or suggestions as they go throughout their work. And this year, the best practice suggestions or recommendations were centered around technology. And I know the IT department, I know Ben greatly appreciates, considers these, and with a cost-benefit analysis, sees if they fit the City of Boulder. Lastly, the middle bucket, this year, there were 2 adjustments that needed to be made from the unaudited to the audited financial statements. And these were centered around issues where legal counsel's guidance was needed. The external auditors always communicate both in-house, city attorney's office, and with any external outside legal counsel that might be helping the City of Boulder. through those communications, they found an interesting, usually auditors, finance department are worried about loss contingencies. Is there something out there that might require an obligation on the city of Boulder's part? Looking for council's guidance. The interesting one this year was an inflow of funds from a project where the city of Boulder had safely, conservatively escrowed the funds, and through the guidance of in-house city attorney's office and external auditors, it was determined that a settlement had been made wherein these funds didn't need to be escrowed. They were actually revenue to the city of Boulder. The auditor's recommendations were more enhanced communication between the finance department and those involved in these situations. In addition, the finance department believes performing more robust analytics might, give them a heads up a little quicker so the communication process can start. The second resolution is to appoint Clifton Larson Allen to perform the audit of the 2017 financials. From what the audit committee sees, there appears to be evolving a solid professional work relationship between both the external auditors and the city staff, and this should only enhance both sides' ability to achieve their objectives. In closing, I'm one who honors a streak, so I've got superstitions around this. The city of Boulder is going for their 28th consecutive award for achievement excellence in financial reporting, 35th overall. So one of these days, when I choose to step away or I serve at your pleasure, if you step me away, I might go look to see where the city of Boulder is positioned with regard to total awards won or who has the longest consecutive streak of excellence in reporting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have some comments from the audit committee.
Okay.
This is my first year on the audit committee. Thank you very much, Professor Frederick. It's wonderful to have an outside person with the kind of expertise that you got to really ask some of the tough questions and to represent this so well. So thank you very much. I had a lot to learn this year, and what I saw was this kind of building the relationship that Professor Frederick talked about between the auditor and the city. And I think it's, of course, we want complete honesty, and we want Clifton Larson Allen to always call out what they see, but I felt like the city, Cheryl and her team were very responsive to all the comments, put action plans behind it, as well as the IT department. So I felt like the city was very, very responsive to all the feedback they got from Clifton Larson Allen. And so it gives me a great deal of confidence that we have very good order around our finances. So I'd like to congratulate the team. Obviously, we have some things that we need to work on, but I felt like there are action plans in place, already things being done, ticked off, and so it gave me a great deal of comfort.
I concur with what Jan said. I've been on the audit committee for a little while, so the first year is really something to see when you figure out what a clean report is and then what the different levels of imperfection look like. But on the whole, I feel very comfortable that the city's in a great financial position, that most of our systems are working well together. There's always places that they can knit together a little bit better, but IT was involved, as well as our financial department, as well as this year some more feedback to our legal team. So on the whole, I'm pretty pleased with where we are and feel comfortable with the selection of the auditors for next year.
Okay, well, congratulations to Cheryl and her team. Thank you to the professor, and thanks to the audit committee for serving. It is a committee that I have so far managed to stay off of. And I intend to continue that streak. And with that, we'll turn to our consent agenda, which includes adopting these resolutions we just spoke to. Do you want to announce? Did I just steal your
You just
thunder?
did. Items A through F.
Items A through F on our consent agenda. We did just speak to the audit items. Sam, did you want to speak to your
Sure.
resolution?
I'd just like to thank the Citizens Climate Lobby and our energy staff, because one of the items on our consent agenda tonight is a resolution in support of comprehensive national climate policy in the form of a revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend. So this is a policy that a lot of local groups have supported, but the Citizen Climate Lobby as an organization has taken this concept national so that we can begin to educate federal representatives at all levels about how important it is to have a price signal on carbon, because the market is one of the most powerful forces that unites humans and the way we behave and so on. And, you know, physics and chemistry are some of the most powerful forces that are going to determine how our kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews live out their lives. So I won't read all of this because there's a lot of detail behind it, but in short, it basically encourages the federal government to adopt a price on carbon and to refund most of that carbon to the citizens of the country. So the idea behind it is this is not a net outflow. This just helps people who consume more realize the consumption through their pocketbook, and people who consume less be rewarded for that. And so at the end of the day, I think this is something that we should make sure gets forwarded to our federal representatives. And thanks to the Citizen Climate Lobby people for keeping on me, because I was not the fastest at getting this across the finish line.
Well, and I'll just note, I got invited to participate in the National Renewable Energy Lab and Sierra Club's national dialogue on 100% renewable, the pathway to 100% renewable energy, with about 35 other cities from around the country. And one of the speakers was Senator Merkley from Oregon, and he has a national bill. But one of the takeaways was we need to put a price on carbon, that is, as a country, the most important thing we could do. And absent that there's all this other work that all these cities are doing, and it's pretty inspiring. But I think it's really important for us to send a signal to our national leaders that they need, we're counting on them to eventually take some action here. Okay, I'll just note in terms of other things up there, we have the first reading on the sales and use tax, and that will be the subject of a public hearing at second reading. Did you have anything you wanted to say to that?
Yeah, that's the community and culture tax that you're
Yeah,
referring to?
yeah.
I understand we're not going to speak about it tonight, and I think it's better to talk about it when everyone's here. I will be sending in a note to Hotline, because I do think there is a little bit more vetting that needs to happen, particularly of the community projects. We discussed this at the last meeting, but I've gotten some feedback since then that, you know, they did not, the community group did not have time to really vet a lot of the projects. So I just think there needs to be a little bit more vetting of the community projects. So I'll just write a brief hotline about that.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, mine is actually pretty straightforward. And David, this is mostly for you. I could send this in unless we want to fix it up on first reading. I got some wording questions on the item on the ordinance 8195, which is amending various sections of the charter. And these are not substantive, they're wording.
Okay.
So David, I'll just do them quickly, and you can do with them what you want. This is the first one's on page 343, having to do with vacancies. And I have to say, I read the clarifying language, and I couldn't figure out what it was saying. So it didn't clarify it for me. Wouldn't it, this is a question for you, David, and maybe you look at it later, can't we just say if there's a vacancy in a calendar year before August 1st, then the election is held in November of that calendar year, otherwise it's held in November of the following calendar year. Wouldn't that be like 100 times simpler than
Yeah, we can look at that.
the
But yeah,
convoluted wording that's there?
yeah, no,
I read this 3 times, and I could not figure out what
Yeah,
following November meant.
sure. Sure, and I think that to some extent, it was probably overly trying to reuse the language.
Right, that's what I decided.
Yep.
Instead of starting over, it was trying to reuse the language that was there. The other one, also on page 343, number 29, withdrawal from nomination, it says, if a withdrawal occurs on the 65th day preceding the election, the votes cast for that person shall not be counted, which is fine, but I am sure it means if it occurs on the 65th day up until the election, not just only on the 65th day, because that would be kind of irrelevant.
Okay.
And the last thing, which maybe there was a reason for, but I sure couldn't figure it out, was on the ballot title, which is down on page 347, it kind of lists the changes, which is all perfectly fine, but one of the changes it lists says, have signatures no older than 180 days prior to filing. But that's not a change, that's already in there.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
And so I don't, unless I was missing something, which I might be, I didn't see why that was in the title, because that's already in the code.
Okay, I'll look at that.
You should look at that, too. And we can fix all of this up on the next reading, but
Okay.
they probably should be fixed up. I mean, it's in our charter, after all.
Yep, and
That's
that's
it.
the intent.
As I said, not substantive, just, I got confused reading.
Well, thanks for your eagle eye. Okay, is there anything else on the consent agenda?
Just one item, you do have a blue sheet on your dais, and that is the ordinance, the first reading of the debt ordinance for the capital improvement projects. And our finance department requested a minor change to delete the word bond and replace it with debt, just as in an effort to be clear that we will probably use perhaps other approaches to borrowing money other than bonds for this short period of time. So it's just a clarification.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, with that, can I have a motion?
I move the consent agenda with the clarifying amendment on the
Second.
dais.
We done with the discussion? Okay, there's a second reading, so I guess this is roll call.
Roll call vote. We'll begin with Councilmember Weaver,
Aye.
Young. Aye. Applebaum,
Aye.
Brockett,
Aye.
Burton, Jones.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay.
You have one call-up check-in this evening. It's a form-based code review application for 3200 Bluff Street.
And I am interested in calling it up for the reason that it is the first project that comes before us with the form-based code ordinance in place, or the form-based code guidelines in place. It's not really an ordinance. And given that that's the first project that goes through, I'd like to, it'll set the stage for projects to come, and I want to make sure that council has an opportunity to review it.
Okay. So with that, we will discuss this at the end of the meeting and vote on whether to call it up.
Okay. So we have staff members available right now. It would be great if you could ask your questions of staff members so that they don't have to wait till the end of the meeting.
Okay? Does anybody have questions about the project? Or questions of staff? Matt?
Well, it's not so much a question, but since you're here, and I don't know, I mean, I barely got a chance. I did look at the planning board minutes and the staff material just because I was curious. And it might be helpful if somebody could very briefly, unless everybody's read the stuff, indicate why planning board called it up and what the key issues were. Because there were only really a couple of critical issues, I guess I would say, and planning board did seem to look at them with a fair amount of depth and concern, and in the end voted to approve it because of a variety of things. So I skimmed that myself, and it might be helpful to understand slightly more what planning board was concerned about and why in the end they were okay with it.
Sure. Carl Geiler with Planning. So the project met the vast majority of the form-based code, which is really the intent, but the council will recall that there were some concerns about if the form-based code were to be too rigid, that perhaps there should be an exception process. So we did work in the ability to request exceptions to the requirements. So in this case, the particular project was actually started off as a site review project because it predated adoption of the form-based code and required the applicant to then amend their plan after the form-based code was adopted to meet all the form-based code standards. So when the application came in, it had quite a few exceptions, and we had to kind of work through those exceptions. So there were basically 6 exceptions that were ultimately requested and approved. 2 board members were concerned about the maximum building length. So in the form-based code, there's a 150-foot maximum for building length. In this case, there were facades that went up to about 180 and almost 190 that required the exception. There was also a requirement that the project cannot take access from a type A street. So in this place, the north-south junction place is type A, and because they didn't have an alley, they had to request an access point off a junction place, and also because they're subdividing the property. So those were the main reasons that it was called up. One board member wasn't really convinced and obviously voted against the project largely based on the building length and the access. The others understood the reasoning for the requests. I think they found that the massing of the building was appropriate and was pedestrian friendly and did have pedestrian penetrations into the site, which is some of the main reasons why the maximum building length provision was required through the form-based code. So through their discussion, it ended up being a 5-1 vote.
And I just ask one more quick question. Most of us, when we think of, at least when I think of form-based code, I mean, yes, I think of building length and other stuff, but I also think of design aspects as much as anything. In general, was planning board and the design board reasonably happy with the design? I mean, did it meet or exceed our goals with the form-based code, or did we have some difficulties with what eventually was approved?
I got the impression from the board that they were pleased with the results based on the quality of materials and the detailing that went up on the facades, and that they felt that the massing and use of the building was appropriate for its location. I don't know that they all felt as strongly, but 2 board members obviously had, some concerns. But overall, I felt relatively positive. Design Advisory Board also felt that it was that there were well-designed buildings. They also brought up the concerns about the access off Junction Place. Not as much concern on DAB with the maximum building length. They did talk about the quality of the materials and things like that.
Thanks.
Any other questions of staff? Okay, well, you don't have to hang around, but we'll discuss this at the end. Okay.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Your first public hearing is a motion to approve the purchase of approximately 615 acres from Boulder Valley Farm.
All right, good evening, Mayor and council members. I'm Bethany Collins, a property agent with Open Space and Mountain Parks. And tonight, this agenda item is a request for approval of the purchase of the Boulder Valley Farm open space property. And I'd like to take a few minutes tonight to present some of the details and unique values that make this proposed acquisition so special. As a quick overview of the proposed acquisition, the Boulder Valley Farm property located on North 95th Street is a 615-acre agricultural complex featuring, among other exceptional attributes, important soils, 8 ponds, and almost 1.5 miles of Boulder Creek frontage. The $9.5 million purchase price will include the residences and agricultural infrastructure associated with the farm, as well as significant water rights. This project also offers the opportunity to acquire the remaining mineral and oil and gas royalty holdings of the Boulder Valley Farm Corporation, both on this property and the adjacent Culver property previously acquired by the city. This guarantees the best possible control of any future oil and gas development on a property that has active wells under existing leases. This property is the remaining portion of the historic 950-acre cattle ranch owned by the Don and Rosalie Culver family since 1961. The city acquired 250 acres west of 95th Street from the Culvers in the 1990s, as well as conservation easements over portions of the farm in 1992 and 2006. The farm's adjacency to other city and county property interests makes it attractive from a habitat connectivity and landscape scale perspective. In the context of our open space and mountain parks charter purposes, the farm is considered a high priority for acquisition by program staff and represents an important addition to the open space system because of its important features and valuable resources. The proposed acquisition includes valuable water rights used to irrigate the farm's expansive agricultural fields and also hosts open ditch corridors along the Leggett and Lower Boulder Ditch and nearly 1.5 miles of Boulder Creek and its associated floodplain. This is the longest remaining segment of the creek in private ownership in Boulder County, and ownership would allow for extension of the Boulder Creek Master Plan, restoration work that is occurring both up and downstream of this parcel. This riparian corridor also boasts cottonwood gallery forests that are important to canopy nesting riparian songbirds and is a movement corridor for deer and other mammals. The property's gravel pond complex, boasts healthy wetlands while also offering extensive wetland restoration opportunities. Adding to the farm's valuable ecological resources, the Boulder Valley Comp Plan shows the property as being contiguous to parcels with known populations of Preble's meadow jumping mouse, and its riparian areas near open water and adjacent uplands could provide appropriate habitat for this federally threatened species. Also, the extensive hay fields on the property provide habitat for grassland nesting birds, which may include uncommon species like bobolinks, a rare species in the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, and a management indicator species in the Open Space and Mountain Parks Grassland Plan. From a scenic perspective, the farm is highly visible from surrounding private and open space properties and 95th Street and offers sweeping views of the Front Range and towards the Eastern Plains. Despite being an active agricultural operation, the farm boasts important natural area attributes as well. It has historically supported one of the largest heronries in Colorado, with numbers reaching over 200 nests in the 1990s. Heron numbers have since declined, in part because of the recent presence of the bald eagle pair that began nesting on the property in 2014. However, herons do still frequent the property's ponds and riparian corridor, and at least one active nest was found in 2017. Nevertheless, the pair of nesting bald eagles on the property is a sign of high-quality riparian and aquatic habitat. The pair has fledged young successfully since 2015. The farm also includes an active osprey nest and outcroppings of Fox Hill sandstone seen in the rare white rocks geologic formations on other OSMP properties. Moving on to its agricultural significance, as the map shows, a majority of the property's agricultural fields are designated as farmland of national, state, or local importance. Boulder Valley Farm is a working cattle ranch that has historically supported up to 150 head and produced 500 tons of brome and orchard grass hay. The farm includes a headquarters compound where a majority of the property's improvements are located, including equipment barns, horse stalls, and cattle handling infrastructure. Aesthetically appealing for its pastoral character, Boulder Valley Farm's historical agricultural operation and buildings also contribute to the agricultural history and quality of life in this area. The property was homesteaded in 1885 by Jeremiah and Augusta Leggett, and the Culvers later purchased the property from Axel Nielsen, a locally renowned businessman and philanthropist who is reported to have hosted President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the property's iconic red brick home. During the 1990s, the Culvers had historical and cultural surveys performed by Boulder County, which found the property eligible for local landmark and National Register of Historic Places designation. However, the family never pursued listing. Those surveys indicate several structures on the farm, including the brick farmhouse and barn, are historically and architecturally significant for their association with the development of agriculture in the Boulder Valley. The property's size, location, and water features make it appealing for public access and potential passive recreation opportunities, including hiking, biking, and bird watching. Also, the ponds have historically been privately fished for bass, bluegill, and crappie, and a segment of the potential UP-RTD Valmont to Erie Regional Trail bisects the farm, which could provide future public access opportunities. The growing town of Erie's comprehensive planning area boundary and Boulder Valley comprehensive planning area connect at the eastern boundary of the property. Both plans indicate natural area, open space, and agricultural type land uses in this area, potentially reflecting an intended spatial definition of the urban core of Erie, buffer to the more intensive residential developments just east of 287, and priorities to preserve the area's agricultural heritage. Additionally, because of its overall ownership, stretch of Boulder Creek, and partial location in Area 3 of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, the farm is identified in the 2013 OSMP acquisition plans, Boulder Valley Comp Plan Priority Acquisition Area. Moving on from charter purposes, I'd like to touch briefly on the benefits of fee acquisition of the farm despite its current conserved status. The terms of several conservation easement agreements encumbering the property vary, with most of the protections being focused on the agricultural values and silent or vague on the other resource values, and none of them require a management plan for any portion of the property. It's quite conceivable that a future private owner of the farm would struggle with management of this unique agricultural block or convert some or all of the property from agricultural productivity. Fee acquisition of the farm and water rights represents the opportunity for the city to control the management of the agricultural operations and other uses and ensure the availability of the water to irrigate the property. It would also allow the city to manage public access and possibly integrate a wider application of other OSMP purposes in addition to traditional agriculture, including expanded restoration of the riparian corridor, managing for wildlife and habitat, and preserving and interpreting the historical significance of the property. Upon acquisition, the property will remain closed to the public until resource assessment and management recommendations are developed during OSMP's property integration process. During this time, OSMP staff will more closely evaluate the resource management and infrastructure needs of the farm, and careful considerations will be made to balance public use with the ongoing agricultural operations and protection of the sensitive environmental resources. It is anticipated in the interim, and where possible, the farm will be leased to existing residential tenants and the current ranch manager, who is also an agricultural tenant on other OSMP lands. Questions?
Actually, I do have a question. What you just said about its future use, can you just clarify, going forward, assuming we approve this, which I imagine we will, it will continue to be used for agricultural immediately. We're not going to have a timeout where we
Correct. On a property this size, we needed kind of an immediate A1 plan, and that is in the short term to keep it status quo, to keep the current ranch manager, lease it back to him for the agricultural operation. There are tenants in the residences, and to keep them in where possible. And again, a lot of that just depends on is pending due diligence and being able to negotiate those leases with the city rather than with the landowners, but those are looking good, so, yeah.
Okay, good, because I think that's really important that we don't.
Yes, definitely.
Acquire agricultural properties and then not do anything with them while we plan, and then it's really hard to get them back running again.
Yes, yes.
One other question. it has to do with easements. We have these old easements. Did we pay for these easements?
We did. So there are several easements. Some are with the county, some are with the city, there's actually also a utilities easement that was it was not paid. Well, I believe it was grant funded, but it was a partnership project. There is two conservation easements that were paid for, yes, with city funds, with OSMP funds. The fee purchase price at this point does reflect, the per acre value does reflect the diminished value on a per acre basis of that, of what that,
Okay.
what we've already purchased, basically.
Okay,
Those
that's what I
rights.
wanted to understand, and I assume that the terms of new easements are much better than terms of old easements, but I just want to make sure we're learning and evolving in how we address these. But it's good that we're not paying twice.
Correct.
So, anyhow, this is clearly a gem. It's so exciting that this is finally happening, just the sheer size and also the mile and a half of Boulder Creek. That's just so important. So congratulations on that. Does anybody have questions or comments?
Hi, thank you for that, and I agree with Suzanne, it's pretty exciting.
You're right.
I did have just some kind of minor questions, mostly out of curiosity. The memo mentioned that the farmland was of national importance, so what constitutes national importance is one of my questions. And the other question is, it also talked about a headquarters compound, and what constitutes a headquarters compound? So if you could just clarify.
I believe that's pretty much just a lingo thing. It's got barns, it's got the equestrian, or the horse stalls, it's got an office, for the ranch management, the ranch managing area of the property, barns, the outbuildings. So they're all pretty consolidated into almost,
And are those the buildings that are right off of 95th Street?
Correct,
right?
yes. The dark brown buildings you see right off of 95th. And then as far as what constitutes national, state, or local importance, it's USDA and NRCS basically ranking of what is in the soil. So it's a soil ranking and the types of soils and their productivity for, things like vegetables, like, hay, and how well, it's a nutrient and basically, again, soil calculation done by the NRCS and mapped nationwide by the National Resource Conservation Service.
Thank you.
Natural.
I have a question. So as part of the evaluation, the putting together a management plan, will you be evaluating the potential for small-scale organic farms like we were just discussing in the agricultural master plan?
They will absolutely see how this property, as a whole, as well as, as segmented parts, both from facility standpoint, as well as the cattle operation, as well as the soils and things like that, how those fit into the different purposes and the different characteristics of the new ag plan, yes.
Great.
Absolutely.
Bethany, you're right, this is a stunning piece of property. I'm curious, and I asked you, but a community may not know this. It's a long way from Boulder, and I was curious as I drove out there why we would be buying this as a city as opposed to the county. Can you comment on that?
Part of it is opportunity. It has been actually on and off the market, and the family is not in a place where they want to continue ranching, and so it really is getting to a point where the property will start. The actual operation will start being impacted. They have auctioned off all of the equipment on the property, and so there really isn't, they're getting to where they want out, and so the actual management of the property could go downhill. We have interacted with the county and looked at basically our individual and joint priorities for acquisition, and the county just has opted to put their money towards other projects around the county, and as you've pointed out, it's basically, it's kind of wedged between both city and county land, and so it could make sense from either of us, and the city was just the one prepared to be able to move forward with it.
Sam?
So you mentioned the boundary with Erie. Has there been discussions between the city and Erie about what Erie plans ultimately for the other side of 287 there?
There has not. Just the other side of 287 is also still, at least in their comprehensive planning area, considered agricultural for a very, as we've pointed out, a very short distance as those residential subdivisions are coming up on 287. I have not entered into discussions other than getting information from them on the comprehensive planning area and just the county and city participation in discussions related to the UP and RTD trail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it certainly seems like it would be fertile ground to have that conversation just to preserve the rural character kind of on both sides, so it's not subdivisions on one and open on the other.
Right. Okay. Hey, just one more thing. In terms of, you mentioned that they had done the current owners had looked into National Historic designations. Is that something that we might be doing as part of the management plan?
So our cultural resource staff will look at the assessments that have been done. Very often, one of their first steps would be a historic structure assessment, which is kind of separate from the county process and outside of that, but does take into account, obviously both the state historic preservation as well as national historic places kind of criteria and everything. So that will be part of that initial kind of property integration, is doing those assessments and seeing what the benefits, the pros and cons would be of listing all or a portion of the property.
Okay. All right. This is listed for a public hearing. Has anyone signed up?
No one has signed up.
Okay. Well, then we will open and close the public hearing. How about a motion?
I don't have the language in front of me.
Oh.
Sorry. Here we go. So I move that we approve the purchase of approximately 615 acres of land, associated residences, and agricultural outbuildings, and appurtenant mineral and water rights from Boulder Valley Farm, Inc. for $9.5 million for open space and mountain parks purposes.
Second.
Okay.
Speak to my motion for a minute.
Please.
Well, I had the opportunity to go out and tour the property yesterday. Thank you, Bethany, for you and your staff taking me on that tour. And this is such a gorgeous piece of land. And it checks so many of the boxes in the agricultural plan that we just adopted, as well as the other open space charter purposes. It's an amazing opportunity. So I'm really excited that we're taking advantage of it right now. So I think we generally all agree on that. I did have one particular little point that I wanted to make while we're at it. I know that we'll be doing management planning on a number of different areas, including potential passive recreational use. And just that Union Pacific RTD trail seems to me like a huge opportunity because the White Rocks property also is along that right-of-way. So just put in a plug for maybe prioritizing the evaluation of making a connection between those two properties on an already existing right-of-way. So I'll just throw that out there.
I will second what Aaron said as far as being a wonderful opportunity, and I think it is a little ways out, but with the right connector trails could be something that you could make into a long day to get there and back. And I think that, part of the mission of open space is preservation of, the area around the city, and this is affecting that end. And so I'm glad we've got the opportunity, and thank you for pursuing it.
Thank you.
Matt?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. Jan and I were out there, a couple of weeks ago, and it's pretty spectacular, particularly the Boulder Creek, the riparian corridor, which clearly needs to be preserved, and the water rights, which is no small thing. I mean, they're not, you don't think about them visibly, but they're a quarter of the price of the property, and the water rights are pretty significant. I will say it's a little disappointing the county did not contribute significantly. When we say it's a long way away, that's a bit of an understatement. It is due south of Longmont. It is almost adjacent to Lafayette, and it's almost adjacent to Erie. And so it's by far our easternmost property, which will also raise some mineral and oil and gas concerns as well over time. There are some operations on the property, which is fine. We have oil operations on other open space, so there's nothing particularly unusual about that, but it may put us more in the discussions over oil and gas in the future, because there are some mineral rights that we're not getting. So that part is disappointing. I think Sam's comment is well taken, though, that given how far out this is, even though it's surrounded by some open space, as well as by, on the perimeters, there are houses there. But I think it is going to be really important to now, for us, more than we might otherwise have, kind of engage in what's going on in that part of the far eastern part of Boulder County, because it will affect our open space holdings and potentially some trail corridors as well, now that we're that far east. So I do think we probably need to keep an eye on some things that we maybe otherwise would not have, because we're now in a location that's a little bit different than we have been in the past. But yeah, it's a spectacular property, and it certainly needs to be preserved, especially the critical portions of it. So yeah, kudos to the department for being patient and managing to pull it off.
Hey, can you just speak to that, the part about oil and gas? We're getting most of the mineral rights, but not all of them?
We do not. There are, prior to the Culver's ownership, there were some severances. We will acquire, by the end of this acquisition, a majority, a huge majority of the oil and gas rights, the mineral rights, and we also get the royalties from the wells that are already operating on the property. So this puts us by owning the fee title of the property, the surface of the property, as well as a majority interest in the oil and the mineral rights under the property. It puts us in the best possible place to control what happens on the property. That's not to say, again, Boulder County regulations, state regulations will always, those will be what regulates oil and gas development on the property. Right now, the restrictions are that they could drill from the current sites, so the current pads, if they were to open it up for drilling in the future. And it also, just as with any property in that location, we also, there's also the risk of pooling. So even if we owned all the mineral rights, that doesn't mean they couldn't pool us in. So and still drill on this property. And so oil and gas is
sticky wicket.
Separate sticky wicket. So, yeah.
Well, I would be curious.
I said a follow-up question, but
to know about, if I remember correctly, and that's a big if, that our oil and gas moratorium and current things apply to our open space acquisitions. I would just be curious to know at some future date from our legal office exactly how those things layer, because darn tootin' this will become an issue later.
So, and my question would be, is it true that that by buying the remaining mineral rights on the property, that we would be preventing the possibility of drilling from anywhere other than the existing well site?
Correct. They would have to come forward to us to negotiate a new lease and/or new surface use agreements and new well pad locations. Yes.
Right. So, and we could say no.
And we could say no. Yes.
Yeah, that's the key part of that question. Jan?
I agree with everything that's been said so far. It is a substantial purchase amount, but we do have that much in the open space budget and more than enough to cover it. And I think the citizens have supported this kind of thing. So I'm very supportive of it. It is a stunning piece of property. And I really do hope that we can quickly do that plan so that our residents can get out there and enjoy it. And not just for recreational, although I think it's an amazing piece for recreational, but I think when I heard a few weeks ago that 16 million Americans think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows, I think there is some need to get people tied in with land and what agriculture is all about by getting them out there. And I think preserving that agricultural use is important, But I might also say, raising of cattle is not the most planet-friendly, and so I'd really like to see us transition some of it, not all, but at least look strategically at how we can make an example of a property like that that could transition from kind of pure cattle and feed grain to food for people. And again, not happening immediately, but that's something that could be done in the planning process long-term. But I fully support the acquisition. I think it's a stunning piece of property, and it's great to see that it won't be developed.
Yeah, I already gushed during questions. This is a gem for sure.
It's a good one.
Okay, anything else needs to be said?
Show of hands vote.
Show of hands. All those in favor? It is unanimous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your next public hearing is regarding 3 electric utility ballot measures: the utility occupation tax, executive sessions, and utility formation.
Great, thank you, Lynette. My name's David Gear. I'm the Deputy City Attorney, and I'll be presenting tonight. I'd also like to just take this opportunity to introduce Heather Bailey, our Energy Utility Director, Cheryl Patelli, our Chief Financial Officer, and of course, Bob Icahn, our Chief Financial Advisor. They're here to help answer any questions that you may have that there's a good chance that I won't be able to answer. So tonight, you're going to consider second reading of these 3 ordinances. If you amend any of them on third reading, if you amend any of them, third reading will be on August 15th. If you find any of the ordinances acceptable this evening, we would ask that you would just continue them to the August 15th meeting as well. The reason for this is we're trying to set a deadline for when we would expect all of our city employees to begin to honor the requirements of the Fair Campaign Practices Act. Yes, sir.
I want to make sure I heard that advice right. You would ask that we continue to second reading anything that gets amended tonight? Was that?
No, that is not amended. So if you're good with the staff recommendation and the ordinance that as presented this evening and as you passed on first reading, we would just ask you to do the second reading on it. Just finish the second reading on August 15th.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay. So why we're here, as you all know, our utility occupation tax, at least a portion of it, is expiring at the end of this year. We also have limited authority related to matters associated with formation of the municipal utility for executive sessions. That authority is expiring at the end of this year. And then, of course, Charter Section 178, which is a section of our charter that talks about the conditions preceding to forming the electric utility. We've been in a great deal of litigation about that, and we would like you to consider putting on the ballot some changes to that to perhaps help us resolve some of that litigation. So we have some questions for you regarding the utility occupation tax, and I think that these questions on the screen right now, I'm not going to go through them, are going to be the basis for your discussion later this evening. The utility occupation tax, just a little bit of background. It was originally passed in 2010. It was passed to replace the franchise fee that we received from Xcel Energy as a result of being in franchise with Xcel. At some point, we decided to extend it in 2015, and that revenue source is in place until 2022. After we did some initial feasibility work on the creation of the municipal utility, we decided that we needed to also fund a revenue source for creating the municipal utility, and we have been collecting as part of the utility occupation tax about $2 million, and that money is primarily used to fund our municipalization effort. So you've seen this table many times. It's really a conceptual, it shows in a conceptual manner the path forward to get to the municipal electric utility operations. The red bar in the center is the point of a go, no-go decision. Prior to that time, the city will have completed the PUC transfer and separation case that we are presently litigating. We will have completed the final design and cost estimates for what it's going to cost to separate from Excel. And then, of course, finally, we hopefully will have a decision in the Boulder District Court on the amount of what it will cost to purchase the assets that will form the backbone of the municipal utility. After that point in time, it is thought that we will have a pretty good idea about what we're looking at in terms of what it's going to take to form a municipal utility. This is going to form what we call the go, no-go decision time. And at this point in the process, I think that the council will look at all of the data, and they will decide whether or not, assuming one of the charter amendments that is being proposed tonight, whether to put a matter on the ballot to determine if the city should in fact form the utility. So that go, no-go decision is something that ultimately would be placed before the voters. So here's the part why we have all the finance people here tonight. The Boulder Energy Future staff did a pretty good, strong regulatory analysis, as well as the budgetary needs that it will need to get us to that no-go decision. As you'll see in the third line up from the bottom, the amount that they are estimating that it will take us to get to the no-go decision in terms of getting through all of the regulatory and judicial approvals necessary is approximately $16.5 million. Just extending the existing utility tax forward, you'll see in the second line from the bottom, we estimate that that would raise only $6.3 million in revenue. So the revenue need that we're looking at in terms of going back to the voters for is an effort to raise that $10.2 million. So I guess just before I go on to beat a dead horse, the $6.3 million is an extension of existing revenues. The $10.2 million is an ask for additional revenue in the form of the utility occupation tax. So then it goes to, once you kind of get there, how do you go about collecting it? The information that's before you above is our estimates of what the annual amount that we'll have to collect each year based on a variety of options. We have a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, and 6-year option above. The ordinance is drafted and with a staff recommendation based on the 6-year tax collection, and I believe the primary reason for us proposing the 6-year option is that it has the smallest impact to the rate base in terms of how the utility occupation tax is ultimately passed through from Excel to the customer. The finance department has a plan in terms of how we would be able to use existing reserves to cover any additional revenue expenses that we would need to cover in the early years. I believe also the Energy Future Office has thought about perhaps some creative ways of contracting with the thought in mind of being cognizant of trying to mitigate any impacts that the general fund might have to take in the early years. So this slide here is pretty simple. It's really just a summary of the rate impact that we anticipate a customer will see if the utility occupation tax is increased. As you see, that our estimate is 70 cents a month for the 6-year option versus $3.22 a month if we were to go forward with the 3-year option. So these are, again, these I showed you showed these to you earlier, but these will be some of the questions that you will consider in your discussion tonight in terms of whether the existing ordinance is acceptable or if the council would like to amend it. The second item that's before you tonight is related to executive sessions. I think that it's pretty, everything is in the ordinance is pretty straightforward. I don't think I'll go through all of the list of things in terms of what is going to be part of the executive session. The main debate that staff has heard from the council is really about the scope of what can be discussed in executive sessions, and I think primarily there has been a concern about or is it advisable for the city council to be able to discuss in an executive session negotiations or settlement strategies that would result in a settlement that did not result in a municipal utility. So there's 2 ordinances that are in your packet for consideration. I think that the first bullet describes the main distinction that's in ordinance number 8184, and that's basically to prohibit the discussion of any franchise in an executive session. The rest of the items that are proposed for amending Charter Section 9 are the same in both ordinances. So, of course, staff is recommending that you pass Ordinance 8190, which does not have the limitation on executive sessions. I think the primary policy rationale is that I think it aids in terms of keeping the council informed of what's going on and the breadth of options that are available to them. All right, so this slide here, questions for council. I think that these are some of the ideas that you guys will be considering when you have your discussion later this evening. Now, finally, Charter Section 178. I'll just talk a little bit about Charter Section 178 because as we were drafting the original charter provisions, that was one section which I think as we were drafting, everybody had another good idea to kind of layer on protections. And I think that many of those great ideas that were layered on for protection provided little gaps that have been really great fodder for litigation. We have been in the process of litigating that matter for about 4 years now. I won't go into the gory details, but as you can see, we have been in litigation regarding whether or not we have been able to demonstrate to a third-party expert that we can meet several criteria that are in the charter. Right now, as we have worked our way from the district court through the Court of Appeals, right now, at the present point in time, we filed a petition for review with the Colorado Supreme Court, and that petition is presently pending. So with that said, of course, we would recommend that you pass Ordinance 8193, and that ordinance contains 2 things in it that I think are very important to form out. It would ask the voters to specifically create the utility in the charter and take out all of the performance metrics. And then in terms of the check and balance that is added in replacement of what we have been litigating about for these many years, is that we would simply require that we put information forward to the voters thereafter and that they would vote on the creation or they would vote on whether or not they were willing to issue debt to actually acquire the distribution system. So it's tied into the go, no-go decision, and it would require voter approval before we actually spent the big money for both the cost of actual physical separation as well as any judgment that we would incur in condemnation. So again, this slide is really related to the conversation that I assume that you will be having after the public hearing. And I believe Councilmember Weaver has provided some language for the council's consideration as well. So with that said, that's the staff presentation. If you have any questions, I'm available. And of course, we have a number of staff members present as well who are available for questions.
Great. Thank you for that, David. And, okay, so if we have any questions before to the public hearing, this is the time for them. Sam?
David, you had a question up there for us about combining the two charter measures into one. How does the single subject rule, which I know applies to Tabor issues, apply to any charter issues?
Well, I think that there's a little bit more flexibility, and I think that the subject that this would be related to is the that they would both be related to the electric utility.
Okay, and so we could combine the executive sessions and 178, whatever we did there.
No, I think that the two would be the vote. Let's see here.
Not those two. Okay.
It would be the vote for the go, no go, as well as
establishing the utility.
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
actually
Okay.
having the voters approve the establishment of the utility.
And then what about the executive sessions portion?
We would do that. We're proposing to do that as a separate measure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, does anybody have questions of staff? All right.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. I just had a question about reserves. And
looking at Cheryl Patelli.
Hi, Cheryl. Question on packet page 419, which would be the item 4B1, page 7. Looking at the tables of the 6-year, 5-year, 4-year, 3-year. So it at the very top, it talks about we start out with a reserve of 24.8 million, and it would go down to 16.85 million, resulting in a reserve of 12%. So the 24.8 million, what level of reserve does that represent?
That represents 17%, which is what we're at right now.
And what's a typical reserve for cities along the Front Range?
We looked at reserves last year, and they typically went anywhere from about where we are at to about 25%. The government finance officer's best practice is that you start at 16% as a minimum, and then you take into account different factors like the risk of certain events and those types of things. Standard & Poor's also, for a strong rating, it suggests 16% as well.
So I guess that raises another question just about, so we would be going down to 12% for a short period of time. What would the period of time be before we would be back up to 16%?
It depends on what scenario you take, but the recommended scenario, about 5 years it would take to get back to that 16%.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We have, Aaron and then Jan.
Cheryl, you mentioned that Standard & Poor's looks for 16% reserve level. Would this endanger our bond rating at all?
I certainly can't give you a final answer on that, but what we do know from experience is as long as, A, this is a short period of time, and B, we actually have a payback plan in place to build reserves up. So, for instance, when a government has a situation, whether it be a revenue shortfall, an emergency, it is common occasionally for reserves to dip below the recommended level, but as long as there's a plan in place on how you're going to replenish the reserve, generally that's looked upon pretty positively.
Thank you.
Jan?
The example that you referred to was a type of a disaster, which then takes the reserves from 16 down to something lower. This is not a disaster, it is a strategy. So my question would be, if we did have a disaster, like another flood or something like that, what could the potential damage be to the reserves? How far could they go down if we had to then address that disaster? And then what happens to our overall ability to get, bonds, et cetera, issued? And at what point do you, because I know our goal has been to increase it up to 20% or even higher, right? So this is definitely taking it in the other direction, particularly the 6-year plan. So how do you, as the CFO, see that in terms of real, financial management?
I'll start with your question about how low can reserves get. Certainly it depends on the disaster. I would say if we had something that was pretty significant, we would look to FEMA or other type of funding, but we all know it takes a while to get that back. So that's something that we would have to look at the time. We also would take into place our budgeting for the next several years if it got to a level that was significantly lower.
How much money did we have to pay for the flood before we got reimbursed by various agencies? Do you remember?
Probably before we started getting reimbursement, about 12 to 15 million.
Kind of a follow-up on that. Was that from the general fund, or did it come from other?
Various funds.
Various funds.
Yeah.
So can we talk about that breakdown a little bit real quick? Because I know that our water utility and our sewer utility were pretty impacted.
And open space.
And
Yeah,
open
open
space.
space
So as far as what we spent right away, how much of that came from the general fund and how much came from the other funds?
The majority in the general fund was for public safety services, which I believe, again, I haven't looked at these numbers in quite some time, but it was maybe $500,000 from the general fund, so it was pretty small. We also had transportation immediately affected. Debris removal was another big one that came out of various funds. We did some residential pickup that came out of the general fund, and then other utilities did a lot of that as well.
So how much are our total reserves right now? So you're showing us general fund reserves, is that correct?
Correct.
And if we look across the utility funds as well, do you know what the reserves like?
I don't have that number, but utilities keep a pretty significant reserve of 25%. That's the policy, and various funds are different, but most funds that have operating costs ongoing that aren't capital keep anywhere from about 10% to 25%.
So, sorry.
Just one last question. My recollection of our target for the general fund post the blue ribbon committees that we had was 15% was our target, and then we felt pretty good about going a little above that. But what you're saying is that either that's not best practices or other cities in the Front Range do higher reserves in their general funds. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and last year we brought to council a plan to be at 20% by 2020. And we're working on the 2018 budget, and we'll be bringing back a recommendation for fund balance to you in September. But that's kind of what we brought last year and what the plan that we were in process of.
Okay.
Can I just ask, why would a city need that kind of reserve if you also have the reserves in the other funds that in the example of the flood, they were the ones that were used to repair the damage?
Well, there's several reasons. First of all, we can't, depending on what the fund is, it's restricted. We can't just use it for anything.
Right.
But it's not just for emergencies, it's also for a revenue shortfall, which, as we're seeing right now with the sales tax, is an issue, but we're actually making some adjustments on the expense side to hopefully counteract that. And then also sometimes opportunities come up for cities. For instance, we just used some of our reserves on the Brenton building, the construction. So when those types of things come up and you want to move quickly, it's nice to have that reserve there.
Okay, so, so going back to Jan's question about some sort of disaster, what kind of disaster could happen that would result in expenses not coming out of the reserves for like open space and utilities that would affect the general fund?
So, you know, our two biggest would be flooding or fires, and both of those most likely would affect the general fund. Is that your question?
Yeah. Well, like I'm thinking of the 2013 flood and how the impact in terms of affecting the reserves was on the open space fund and the utilities funds. So how are floods and fires different that would affect the general fund? How would those not be open space and utilities?
Let me think about that. So certainly depending on the level of evacuations, anything that deals with public safety would be general fund related. However, with fires, if it hits a certain threshold, the state would kick in eventually, so our exposure wouldn't be quite as high. And then with the cleanup, it's that seemed to be our biggest general fund expense outside of public safety, is just we decided to clean up and help clean up and pick up garbage in the neighborhoods that were affected by the flood.
So a fire, for example, would likely be in open space, and therefore it would be the open space fund that would be affected. Is that true?
I mean, it depends what our policy on that would be. So
restoration, for example.
Exactly. Yes. We may not want the open space fund to bear the entire burden of that sort of event.
Okay. But at some point, this, like you said, the state funding would kick in?
That would be more on actually fighting the fires, depending on the damage to the land. I mean, we ran into the same issue with FEMA and our trails and how they viewed that in terms of reimbursement. And in a lot of cases, how they wanted us to put the trails back weren't the way that we felt was the best way to do it. So we actually, in some cases, weren't able to get reimbursed for certain projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Can I ask just one follow-up? The 5-year and the 4-year plan are substantially different in terms of the amount of reserve that we would, the percentage reserve and the dollar amount that we would go to. Were you more in favor of the 4-year or 5-year compared to the 6-year in terms of just pure financial management of the city?
Well, I know, I was just talking to Heather, and I know she is working with CAO to look at ways to actually change the cash flow of the expenses, but, you know, I can say generally, when you do a bond, you do it over the life of what the expense or expected life of that is. So it probably, for me, given the short time frame, I don't think there's a huge difference between the 4-year and the 5-year. Certainly, to get that expense from the fund balance perspective quicker is probably better from a financial perspective.
The shorter time, you mean?
Yes.
Given that this is to get to the go, no-go decision, and we're looking to finance it over a longer period of time than that.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
But I also think they're working on ways to not have so much of the expense up front, so it wouldn't have quite the effect on the fund balance in the early years.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Is that good for questions for now? So why don't we, thank you. Why don't we turn to the public hearing?
Okay, we have 4 people.
Okay. If anybody else wants to sign up, please do so now. And we're going to hear on all 3 of these matters in one hearing. I think we said that before. But with that, each person will have 3 minutes, and we will start with Carrie. And you have the order up there if folks can just be ready.
Hi, my name is Carrie Christianer. I'm a Boulder landlord and a birthed voter. We've come all the way full circle. It feels very much like deja vu in many ways. And it's very hard to talk because I am so supportive of the city's goals, but I've also taken another path, as everybody knows, and most people here. I'm going to focus on the creation of the utility measures. I'm not really going to comment on the other ones. But I have very strong feelings about this particular one, especially due to, my history of understanding where we've been. And actually very strongly agree with staff that the option that was presented here by Mr. Gare, that would include a vote on debt, is the proper way to go. I've been attending the PUC trial. I've taken over 110 pages of notes. And yet nowhere have I heard of a debt approval measure in 2017 mentioned. And I also was there today, and Mr. Icahn, who gave some very intelligent and, good testimony, testified under oath that a 2017 measure would, in his words, be half-baked. And I'm very concerned that the alternate B, which wasn't read aloud, but that I read in the packet last night at late at night because I've been so busy going to this, that I would agree that with Mr. Icahn, that the public is not educated yet on these issues, which was roughly his words. And that alternate B strips the charter of the rate parity provision, which I have found really, wow, we're really going to do that. I think that's totally wrong. And the words that were added instead is that the city would not incur any debt for the separation costs, et cetera, unless, quote, council finds that the utility likely can operate for the 10 years after startup with average annual costs lower than those of Excel during the same period. I would point out that either it's poorly written or it just doesn't make any sense. The muni is going to be 1/20th the size. There is not going to be any apples to apples about operating costs. It's like saying we could incur debt if we go outside and find out that the sky is still blue. I just think that it's really, I was shocked, to be honest with you. In any case, I also think the idea of creating the utility could be problematic still, even though, I understand why you're doing it, but I think that Excel will still have some arguments. I don't know, and they haven't told me that. Last thing is, I think that, just wanted to say that I think that the joint ownership issue or joint use issue is going to be a huge one. And just having lived in Newlands, raised children there, and had people, neighbors that I love, write notes on my car saying, please don't park here. I don't think that people are going to like having a higher pole and more equipment on that would take the views as Malsanitas. Just my guess. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. Chris?
Thank you. Chris Hoffman, 1280 Fairfield Drive in Boulder. First, I want to thank you all for your careful deliberation on this. I really appreciate it. I want to say I support Councilman Weaver's proposed amendments for to extend and increase the utility occupation tax with the 6-year plan, and also on Ordinance 8194 and 8193. I think those amendments make them stronger. I think on the executive executive sessions and formation of utility. I'm still considering that what would be best, but I think Councilman Weaver's amendments make them stronger. What I'd like to focus on is the extension of the utility occupation tax. The extension, in addition, adds only about 2.5 cents per day. And I'm more than happy to pay this. Particularly with the inaction at the federal level on climate, this is the very least we can do. It's up to communities to take the lead. We have a long way to go to meet our climate commitment, and forming the municipal utility is the most efficient way to get there. So I strongly support the extension increase of the utility occupation tax.
Thank you, Chris. Molly?
Hello, council members, and thank you so much for your time. My name is Molly Fitzpatrick, and I'm the organizing director with New Era, Colorado. First off, I want to thank you so much for your dedication these last few weeks and tonight as you determine the appropriate method as to continue our path towards a cleaner and locally controlled power utility. At every opportunity, our community has chosen to advance and affirm the decision we made on the municipalization effort because we know the importance of tackling climate change, and we have no doubt that this fall will be another illustration of this sentiment. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there when it comes to addressing climate change, but we all know that that's not enough, and that's why our community committed to such a serious path despite its complications. Meaningful action addressing climate change is hard and challenging, and there are no shortcuts, especially for our community, which has never shied away from complex problems and consistently has been willing to go where no or few other communities have gone before, and that's why we're here tonight. So that's why we do support the extension of the utility occupation tax to continue this commitment to pursuing our climate goals. Boulder has the most educated electorate in the entire country, and we know that our voters do not make decisions lightly. This is definitely a complex issue, but we trust that the voters understand the commitment to our climate goals and the hard work that a just transition requires. The impact on Boulder's consumers will be small as we continue to pursue the only option we have to reach our community's climate goals. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Molly. Leslie Glustrom.
Good evening, Leslie Glustrom, 4492 Burr Place. I got so enthralled with Molly, I forgot I was up. So thank you as always. And briefly, I support all three ballot measures with language that's very close to what you have. I think there's room for changes if you need to make them, but I think the Section 178 changes are good. And I strongly support a vote of the community before we make that final decision when they have as much information as we can get. Executive sessions, I think it's important to add the language about no executive sessions on discussions that would terminate the municipal electric utility. If XL wants to have a relationship with this community, they need to have a relationship with this community, and that means going through the process that you all go through every week, which is massive public input and all these different opinions, and you have to sort of bring them all together and figure it out. So XL will need to learn how to function in that environment. I know it's difficult for them, but that's what it means to have a relationship with Boulder. So, and on the utility occupation tax, I think there's a slide that will come up in not too long. Diane, I think, got it, and she was going to do it, but I will describe it to you. If we look at the utility occupation tax, under the 6-year plan, we can talk about the 3-year plan in a few minutes too, but under the 6-year plan, about $2.75 million used for muni. In comparison, a very conservative estimate of Boulder's profits that they take out of our community every year is in the neighborhood of $18 million. I've used after-tax numbers. I've used a 4%. We're 4% of XL's sales. We're probably about 5% of their revenue. And I've kept their, so the graph is very stunning because you see the little utility occupation tax numbers down at the bottom, and you see the big red bars, which are XL's profits, and I'm sorry that it's not here, but I'll send it to you. And so, we could do the 3-year plan, or would take it up to about, I think, 5 or 6 million a year for the utility occupation tax. And sweet. because you can see a graph is worth a lot of words. The blue bars are the utility occupation tax. The red bars are a very conservative estimate of Xcel's profits. One way to think about it is we need to invest the blue bars, even if you bring them down to a 5 or 4 or even a 3-year plan. We need to invest those in order to start to bring some of those red bars into our community. And another thought is that if we don't move forward with municipalization, we'll be spending those blue bars anyways, because we'll be sending them down to the Utilities Commission. And with the last 20, and all the other things we'll be trying to do to meet our climate commitment, because there's no real clear way to do it, and we'll just be spending a lot of money on attorneys down at the commission, and you know, we've all been seeing how slow that goes. So I also really want to congratulate staff. They've done a great job down at commission, and we don't know how the decision will come out, but they deserve a tremendous amount of credit. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you email that to us?
I will, yes.
Thanks. Lynn Siegel.
Lynn Siegel, 538 Dewey. I support the occupation tax, 6 years, small price to pay. And I do not support executive session for anything ever. I don't believe in secrets. And when money transacts and lawyers get in rooms, I especially don't believe in secrets. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. Anyone else? Okay, we'll close the public hearing. Okay, I suggest that we work through these one at a time. Does that work? So why don't we start with the utility occupation tax? Can you throw up the questions? And this is just one way to structure the conversation. I thought we've already answered these.
Haven't we given clear direction on A through C already?
A through C.
I mean,
so yes, I
it's
agree.
Direction, not final decisions, but
Right.
just
Okay.
confirm.
So I think it comes down to, well, also Sam has some proposed language, but yeah, for how long we want to look at the tax then. And assuming no one's changed their mind, we'll skip right to D. And then Sam, I guess you have language.
And my language doesn't affect D, so we can consider it separately.
Okay. So who would like to speak to the length of the tax? Because we definitely have a trade-off between the hit. Jan and then Aaron.
Well, I sense from the questions that we all have some concerns about the hit on the reserves. Clearly, the longer period of time, customers and businesses pay less, but the hit to the financials for the city is fairly significant. So I guess I guess I'm more on the page of maybe 5 years to try to shell up some of those reserves a little bit more than the 6-year plan would.
Okay. Aaron?
Great. Well, I had asked for the analysis of the impact on the reserves because that was a very material part of my thinking on this question. And if the analysis had showed that the reserves would go down by, a few percent, in the 6-year plan, then I would have supported that. But they show a really substantial reduction in the reserves. My calculations from the numbers that staff provided showed that from our current reserves to the bottom point in each of the years, number of years, that in the 6-year plan, it would take the reserves down 37.5%. The 5-year plan would drop them 33%, the 4-year plan 24%, and the 3-year plan 21%. So there's a pretty big difference in the percentage drop that you get with the different years. But to me, there's the sweet spot in that is at the 4-year level, where you're reducing the reserves by 24%, which is still a substantial chunk, but you're getting them back in 3 years after they first take their drop. And if you cut it back to a 3-year tax, you only get a small benefit to the reduction in the reserve. There's only a small amount less hit to the reserves, if that made any sense. So based on the numbers and the analysis on the reserves, I think the 4-year would give us a chance to spread out the impact on the monthly rates for community members, but have an impact on the reserves that I think would be more acceptable and less risky. So that's the number of years that I would prefer.
Sam?
So I want to bring up a structural issue just about timing before I get into where my thinking is. I don't believe we need to finalize these decisions tonight if we are in what I will characterize as split here, because there's a few people missing. And I don't believe, and David can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that there is a major train wreck if we don't complete anything tonight and we have to see it a couple more times. Is that right, David?
That's correct. It's just your meeting time.
Okay. And I, thank you.
Which is already a train wreck, right?
Right. So anyway, that's context for my next statement, which is if what we heard from Cheryl is correct, that staff is taking a look at potentially adjusting expenses that would impact how this reserve analysis look, I'd be interested in knowing about that before making a final commitment. I mean, I think Aaron's analysis is right for what's here. I would want to pick either the 4 or the 5 year, not the 6, based on this. And so I appreciate you asking the question and staff for providing the answer. But there you go. I'm straddling the fence on 4 and 5. I would probably go more towards 5 if there was a way that we could adjust a spend plan that kept our reserve level a little higher.
Can I ask?
No, just one point on, I think that adjusting how we spend the money is something that we really can't foresee right now, because I think that we're going to have a strategy about how we negotiate contracts, and perhaps one approach would be, and we did this in some of our earlier contracting, is that we set limits on the amount that could be collected in any given year on a contract. But of course, you have to have somebody who's willing to do that, and of course, also that's running a business that can cash flow with those kind of expected future payments. So I really kind of think that it'd be my advice that you look at it more from the worst case scenario with the knowledge that we could probably, as we get into the actual contracting, back that off at some point as we move into the future.
So is that safe to say that we won't be getting any more information that would help influence this decision?
Well, I think, we could give you some more information. My fear is that it would be highly speculative in terms of, we're going to be moving into using other consultants. Other consultants have payrolls to meet. Are they going to be willing to say, I'll take my payment in years 3 and 4 for the work I do in 1? So some of those kind of things, we can certainly try to negotiate them. And I think that as we move forward, we will try to reduce the impact to the general fund. But I think as you do your revenue planning, you probably want to walk into it with some conservative assumptions.
Okay. So if we want to, for instance, I know we need to hear from more people, but let's say we're split on 4 and 5. Would you recommend we just move 2 versions forward or just leave that blank?
I think you could move 2 forward. It would be great if you could have consensus on 1 and re-debate it when you have the full council.
Okay, well, we could just do it that way too.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt?
Yeah, I'm not that different from where other people are. Although I guess I look at the numbers slightly differently. It's, Aaron, I don't think, at least for me, it's not very helpful to say it's 21% less reserves. I mean, what really matters is the reserve balance percentage, which is that bottom line on the chart we've got on page, I don't know, whatever it is, 439. And it's interesting because if you look at 6, 5, and 4,
right?
For the first 3 years at least, for the 6-year plan, the reserve percentage, the balance is 12, 11, 12, and for a 5-year tax, it's 12.5, 12, and 13, not very much different. And for the 4-year, it's 13, 13, again, not very much difference, and then 15. And so really the difference is just how long the reserve is short. And a percentage saying it's 20% difference doesn't tell you anything, honestly. It's more, well, how low does it get? Well, all of these are about the same the first 2 or 3 years, frankly. Not much difference there. And even if you could do some contractual stuff, I don't think it would change those numbers by, what, 0.5%. So, I mean, I think those are going to stay the same. So really, it's the comfort level of having an extra year or an extra 2 years where the reserve balance, at least in theory, is lower than you'd like it to be. At least that's the way I look at it. And, you know, is that a big deal? Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. I mean, we don't, you know, the conversation earlier about disasters and so on was interesting, but, and some of that may come into play someday, but I think the main reason we like to have the reserves as high as we do for operating in the general fund is really economic downturns. And it's not that you can prevent an economic downturn, or you can't in the end eventually, in the end you have to eventually cut things, but you can do so at least at your pace. You can do it a little more slowly and intelligently, and instead of, oh my God, tomorrow we have to, you know,
lay people off.
Cut $6 million out of the budget and lay people off. You know, we've been through some economic downturns. I've been around long enough to be on councils that had to deal with them. They're unavoidable, but you can certainly smooth them out and reduce the community impacts by having some reserve dollars. That's the big deal. So I guess I'm where other people are, 4 or 5 years. I don't know. I'd have to think about it some more. Yes, 4 years means that the tax goes up some. I mean, it doubles essentially. It's not a huge number, but it's, you know, everything matters. You know, in terms of which one is fairer, I just have trouble figuring that out, honestly. You could say, well, it'd be fairer to, you know, make everybody pay for it immediately, but in some sense, this is like bonding because people are paying into something that has a much longer term impact. So the benefit accrues over many, 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 many years. And so in that sense, I don't have much trouble with the tax also continuing over a longer period of time, just like we do with bonding. The catch in this thing is that unlike a bond, because this is general fund money and because a lot of the money needs to be upfronted, you have that window where you have a reserve issue. And that's the part I think we're struggling with, understandably, I might add.
Right.
So, you know, I'd probably move the 4 and 5 year together for 2 reasons. First of all, we're missing 3 people. But secondly, even in the hopes that we could be unanimous on something, which maybe we can be, I think if we did both of them, I think it would help the community focus in on, here are the choices. If you have some opinion about these 2 choices, let us know. There's not a million choices anymore, right? There's a couple of choices. They have pros and cons. Fine. So people can weigh in on that, and we can all ponder it along with our 3 colleagues who aren't here for the next couple of weeks. So that's where I'd go. You know, they're both reasonable approaches, frankly.
Right.
But I think we just need to be honest about what the differences are.
Okay. Well, I'm going to make this short. I agree with you, Matt. And I don't get to say that very often, so I'm just going to say that. I think 4 or 5 is the sweet spot. I mean, the fact that the tax on the average person for 4 years is about $25 a year. Again, not nothing, but is an amount you can get your head around. So I'm fine with letting. I agree with you. We don't have everybody here. Let's call that our decision space, and I could be talked into either one depending on. It'd be nice to know, if people have opinions. I could be talked into 4, I think.
And I think just for what it's worth, I'm probably going to end up coming down at 5. I mean, you look at the differences on, as Matt said, where you get to on the low, as far as the percentage reserve, which is really, I agree, the right way to look at that. And then you look at the difference between 4 and 5, and you're roughly doubling the impact on people from going from 5 to 4. So that 1 year change has saved you 1%. but it's doubled the rate impact. And so when I think about lower income members of the community, that's where I start thinking about 5.
Okay.
I was just going to ask one other quick question, which doesn't really have to be answered tonight, but it could be a couple of weeks. I mean, obviously, we're going to see the budget, the 2018 budget, somewhere along the line here. And I don't know yet what that calls for in terms of perhaps putting some additional money into the reserves. That's something we could choose to do, not only because of this, frankly, but just generally good practice. Cheryl said we were at 17%. We're trying to shoot for 20%. And maybe we do want to try to put a little bit more into the reserves, which would help out with this as well, especially in those immediate years, the first years. And you know, if it doesn't pass, the next council can always do an adjustment to the budget and change all of that if that's what they choose to do. And if it does pass, that might give us a little more relief from some of the concerns we have. Obviously, we haven't seen the budget yet, so I can't answer that question until we see it, but maybe staff could give us a little bit of advice on that.
When they get there? Or you
Well,
meant
even
right
in a
now?
couple of weeks. I mean, the budget.
But no, I meant in a couple weeks, not.
Yeah, in a couple of weeks. No,
Okay.
not right now.
Mary?
And so I, too, don't often get to say I agree with Matt. And I think that I also am leaning in the 5 years, because as I look at the bottom line there in the reserve balance, in the 4th year at the 5-year, you're practically at the minimum recommended reserve. I did just a quick little research as to what is recommended, and that's 16%, so we're practically there in year 4. So I would be leaning towards the 5-year myself.
I'm sorry,
I think.
Can you just clarify, what's 16%? What are you?
Well, no, I just quickly went online and I did a search for minimum reserve balance for cities and found a government report that recommends 16%. So.
And where are you seeing 16%?
I'm seeing in the table with the 5 years, where you at the bottom line there, you've got 12.6, 12.1, 13.2, and then 15.6.
Oh, in year,
it's not
in year 4.
16%. In year 4.
In year 4, you're up.
You're
Gotcha.
almost
Okay.
at
Thank you.
16%. So, and then I think also in light of one of our consent agenda items, which was the audit report and how well the city is managed, and Cheryl's clarification about how our bond rating would likely not be hurt because we have a plan about how to get back up. So but I do think that 6 years starts to make me a little more uncomfortable. 4 years, it seems like it's just, like Sam said, it doubles the impact on folks, doubles. So I'd be leaning in the 5 years.
Okay, so it looks like, Jan, did you give a number? Were you 4 or 5?
Yeah, I think I spoke first before Aaron talked. I mean, I'm pretty conservative from a fiscal standpoint, and so getting down into the 12% range is pretty concerning to me. So I had originally said 5 years. I think 4 years is more comfortable. I mean, I don't think any bond rating company is going to say, I mean, we're taking this decision as a community, not because we had to, because we're voting on it. It's a strategy to take these levels down. And, you know, I don't know how they'll react when, as Cheryl said also, the S&P guidance is at 16%. And we're making a conscious decision to go 4 points below that in the 5-year plan. So I don't know. I think it's good that we don't vote tonight. I think having the 3 extra members would be important. So I really think we should take the 4 and the 5 forward.
Okay. That's then let's do that. You said you want us to choose one and forward that?
You don't have to.
Okay, so maybe we'll just do two
Yeah,
then.
what I want is not relevant.
I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
But now that you mention it,
Slightly relevant.
yes, it is. Okay, Sam had, then let's do both of those. And then Sam, you had language you want to propose?
Yeah, and I don't know if we have it to put up or not, but the essential 2 points that I was bringing forward here was the purpose of why we're doing this, right? So it's to, live up to our climate commitment, the Paris Agreement. Other reasons that we're doing this include improvements to system reliability and creating more energy-related business opportunities. So that's just a set of benefits that I thought we should have in front of the voters as to why we want this to go forward. And then I also thought we might provide some reassurance that if we take a no-go decision that for some reason has to come earlier than we plan, and there could be reasons for that, that we would finish paying off our obligations but stop the tax at that point. And I don't think we've explicitly said that. So I just thought we would put that in there to make it easier for people to understand that we've got rules around what happens if there's a what if.
Go ahead, you had.
Oh, I had a question. Just, David, do we run into any Tabor issues with language like this, or are we fine?
This language I'm fine with.
Great, thanks.
Well, but this, so you'd actually put this, this is really my question, into the ballot title, which would now be one of our longer sentences on record.
I don't care if it's in the title. I
don't know where else it would be. See, that was really my question.
Yeah.
I don't have any trouble with the wording. I just don't quite understand where it is, because...
So my interpretation of it was on packet page 422. If you go to line approximately 5.
That's in the ballot title.
In the ballot title.
Right.
Used to fund costs associated with the municipal electric utility, right. And then you would add this.
Right. And that's what I'm assuming too, but it makes for one heck of a long ballot title. Remember, these things are supposed to be one sentence with a question mark at the end of them. And this probably doubles the length of the already unreadable title. So that gives me a little concern, but of course, if you don't put it in the title, people tend not to find it because, where is it? Well, I don't know. It's nowhere, essentially. It's in some backup material. So I don't know.
And so I did want to strike 2 words from here, David, and it's my fault for not getting it to you. I would pull "and resilience" out at this point. Just focus on one. There's an attempt to bring some words out. And if we want to remove the energy-related business opportunities, that's okay as well. This was just a stab at putting the motivating language into some place where people could find it when they're reading the...
I think it'd be good if we got rid of the energy-related. And again, it's not because I don't agree with any of this. It's just, it's really a more practical issue having a 100-word ballot title sentence that people are not going to be able to parse.
So we probably, if we want to do that, I'd just point out that we want to put an "and" between Paris Climate Agreement and improved system reliability.
Correct.
Wait, are you sure you really want to get rid of the business pieces? I mean, because that's part of, to me, the...
It is. Look, maybe I'm fine with passing this now, but I do think we should all, if we're going to do it, we should go back and really think about what is critical to have in this wording. Because I think when you see these words in the title, you realize it's one heck of a long ballot title.
Okay, well, why don't we just take out "and resilience" and pass it as is, and we know we're setting ourselves up for third reading, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because we already have...
I would like to have some time to talk with people about their thoughts on this as well, because there was certainly among the community members I talked to, there was no consensus, and part of that was just a lack of time to talk it through.
Yeah, well, that's fine. That's fine on both of these issues, actually.
Okay. I think this is really helpful, because one of the problems with ballot titles is they're not in language you can relate to. This helps, I think, paint the picture of what we're talking about. So I think that's worth adding in length.
Again, I agree. If only we had some control over how ballot titles were written, And
Yes.
they didn't have to be written in this stylized, single-sentence nonsense.
All caps.
All in caps, because it's a Tabor issue, that nobody can parse. So that's really what I'm concerned about. It's
Oh, well, no, I totally get you. I was moving on to say, I would support this language as we just amended it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is everybody cool? Okay, we are dangerously close to being done with this one. Oops.
Yeah,
Marion.
and I just wanted to just add a language change request. From the go, no-go, could we call it something like community approval vote, or something like that, instead of go, no-go? It just seems so divisive. And it would be nice to just say voter approval or voter check-in, something that is really more what we're really talking about.
Are you talking about the third thing we're getting?
No, I'm just, oh.
Yeah.
No, I guess we're talking about okay, never mind. So I'll hold that thought.
Okay, so since we're not, I think we're not voting, but
Well,
yes, we are.
I think it would be good to move this language and just amend it if there is a consensus on council, and then we'll try to set up the policy discussion that you'll have on August 15th regarding whether we go with, it sounds like 4 years or 5 years.
Okay.
In terms of length.
So the motion that we're coming up with is to pass two versions, this amended by this language, one for over the 4-year time period and one over the 5-year time period.
Yep.
Okay, I'm making that a motion.
Second.
Any more discussion on that?
Okay, just so that I can clarify, and for the clerk, we'll need another ordinance number, and that the titles of both of those ordinances will reflect the duration of time and the amounts of money for the taxation amounts that are included on packet pages 418 and 419.
Okay, all those in favor? It is unanimous. Okay, thank you for that. Let's go to the executive session one. I think most of these we've answered to, except for the wording. Okay.
Can we get the council questions?
Sure.
Please.
But you might have to come back there.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, got some questions.
Yeah, nothing's happening.
Didn't miss much.
You can just leave it as is and go to the next slide, that's all we need. Okay. Nope. I guess it's many slides. Okay. Okay, yeah, so those aren't particularly helpful. Okay, so I think before we indicated we are interested in moving forward to executive session, and so it's more about the wording of it. So,
Can I ask a question about this?
Yes.
So, David, if we had the version that said that we couldn't discuss a franchise with Excel, would that be something that couldn't be brought up at all? I mean, like if someone in an executive session wanted to say, well, maybe at some point in a meeting we could talk about a franchise, would they be allowed to do that, kind of put the idea out, or would the language prevent even that level of?
I would say it would probably, I mean, if you were being safe about it, you would probably not mention that.
So it kind of, it would strike that, the ability to speak. Yeah. You couldn't say the F word in an executive session. Okay, that was my question. And can I lead with a comment?
Sure, and and then Sam has some proposed language, so we might as well get that in play too.
Great. Well, I mean, I can go either way, honestly, but I think it's important to have some more transparency around executive sessions than we've had in the past. I'd like to see more announcements of the rough topics that we're attacking, which I think is proposed here, that we would give, a subject in as much as it wouldn't compromise the function of the executive session. So I like that. But I would like to retain the flexibility for at least the topic of an agreement to be able to be broached in a session. And I'm happy to, I liked staff's suggestion of needing to notice it if you're going to have an active discussion of that topic, so that we could be open with the community, that if we were going to actually discuss that, have a functional discussion on that, that people would know about it. So that's my preference.
I guess I do have one other question. I totally get the intent of this, and I think Sam's language actually is helpful. If we decided, hey, if we wanted to discuss whether we thought it was time to go into franchise and therefore go public, we can't, that discussion we could not have an executive session.
Yeah, so just to be clear, so ordinance 8194, it's attachment B, that's the more restrictive language, and it provides that, provided however such sessions may not include legal advice or negotiation strategy related to electric franchises. So that's pretty specific in terms of what you can't talk about. The other one, ordinance number 8190, the language is a little bit broader, or I guess it perhaps allows a little bit more flexibility. It allows it to be discussed, but it requires it to be noticed.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Sam, did you want to speak to your language?
Sure. I think the concern in the community, at least some parts of the community, is that there are other ways to discuss settlements that could end the progress towards a municipal utility that wouldn't mention the word franchise or franchises, but you'd be talking about issues that you intend to address with Xcel that would be on the path to terminating the utility. Or I think that specifically is what some members of the public are asking that we have be public. And you heard some of that testimony tonight. I think I'm there with them in that, are we to have a long-term relationship with Xcel? We all need to be practiced at talking about what the main issues are in public. There's nothing about this that prevents individual council members from speaking with David Eves or any other Xcel personnel, right? As long as they're not reporting it back this way, and as long as they're not breaking any other sunshine laws or open meetings rules. So as far as thinking through, with somebody from Xcel, or our staff can talk with Xcel, I don't think this prevents it. What it prevents us from doing is talking as a governing body about stuff that I think a lot of members of the community don't want to be behind closed doors. And so that's why I'm going to support it. And I proposed it that way because there are other issues we would settle with Xcel that could be on the way to a municipal electric utility, right? Like joint use of poles. Well, that's something that we could talk with them about and come up to a settlement with, and it would be moving us towards a municipal electric utility, and I don't think that would cause unhappiness among people who are keeping a close watch on this. So anyhow, there you go. That's how I got to this proposal. And David, I think you had it up. There was like 3 of the words were shown as crossed out when I thought I added them, but.
Yeah, if you were going to go back to that slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's some amendments proposed. I don't know why what's on my screen right now is not. For some reason, it's only allowing me to.
Oh.
So I think that just in terms of, we did a quick analysis of Sam's language. For the most part, I think we're fine with it. There were a couple of components in it that we think adds a little bit of confusion with some of the confusion that we've been trying to take out of the charter. And so the use of the term, the formation of and form, those questions are really going to be dealt with in our next discussion, because we're asking if you also put the charter section 178
I got it. Okay.
stuff on the ballot, we want to resolve the issue of formation once and for all with that charter measure. So these changes are really just intended to make it concurrent with, or consistent with that idea.
Good, thank you for that.
So, go ahead.
I guess I have a question on this one, because I mean, all along, I think the voters expected us to talk about, or they had authorized us to talk about potential off-ramps in one of their original votes. I don't remember which year that was. And so in this language, because an off-ramp doesn't necessarily mean franchise. It is kind of pre-discussions before getting to franchise discussion. And one of the concerns that I have is, I mean, we have been voted in to try to do the best we can for the Boulder entire population and all the voters in the city. And, I mean, this is very difficult stuff. And we have had to talk about, in the past, forming a utility, all the nuts and bolts around it, but also talk about potential off-ramps. And your negotiation capability completely goes away if you have to talk about off-ramps with Excel sitting in the room or listening, right? So in terms of intent, and I think off-ramp is different than a franchise agreement. Clearly, a franchise agreement should and can be done after we've kind of agreed to take an off-ramp or consider an off-ramp. And that, I mean, that's basically what we did when we gave the people a chance to vote in on if we should be considering the off-ramp, right? And we got a no. So I guess that's what I struggle with here, is if we can't talk about anything having to do with an off-ramp in executive session, does that really tie our hands behind our back to come up with the best solution for Boulder?
So I would see, David, if you have any thoughts on what Jan was talking about, because off-ramps, as I understand them, they're charter requirements, right?
Well, so, I mean, I guess that there's probably a couple of different ways of looking at an off-ramp. The first way, and probably the most fatalistic way, is to just say something along the lines of, we're done. We're just going to abandon the efforts. And it seems like if you were to be taking that approach to an off-ramp, that's probably something under this language that you could do. On the other hand, if the objective is we want to try to get as much as we can while taking an off-ramp out of the deal, that's not allowed by this language. And I think that this language is intended to not allow that type of a discussion to happen in an executive session.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Sure.
How does this language allow you to say we're done? Because it seems like that would terminate Boulder's effort to operate in independent municipal.
Because it says franchises or other settlement discussion.
Settlement discussion.
But hang on, we can't take decisions.
Yeah, we can't make a
We can't
decision.
take decisions in executive session, so I have no idea how we could make a decision to.
You wouldn't decide, but this is discussion.
this
right?
Whether you could talk about it, you couldn't make the decision.
Right, you would say, how about we quit having executive sessions and go publicly say we're done?
Right, and if you were in that realm, the realm that's being described here, I think you would probably, or we as staff would go into the same communication mode that we typically do with the council in terms of sensitive topics, either communicating in writing with confidential memos or scheduling one-on-one or one-on-two council member meetings so that we can discuss our concerns in that manner as well.
But the key thing is, if, even with this language, which is, I mean, it's really the same as the what's in our packet, but it's a little more explanatory, which I think I like, because I think for most people, just saying strategy relating to electric franchises is not abundantly clear. And we talk in code, we all know that. And so I think explaining what that means is helpful. But Jan, the reason I'm not worried about what you asked is based on what David said, and also my reading of this is, yeah, if a council at some point, for instance, got some legal advice, or some cost came up, or our engineer said, uh-oh, you could have that conversation in executive session. Council could say, what do you mean? Tell us more about this advice. Tell us how you got here. You know, what are the options, and on and on and on and on and on. All of that would be fine in an executive session, because it is legal advice after all. If council at that point said, gee, we think this isn't going to work, you could talk about it, you could at least say that in the executive session. Of course, then you'd have to go to a public session, but that's true now anyway, because you can't make decisions in an executive session by definition. So you'd of course have to pop back out. So the only thing you can't do would be if the council got to that point and then somebody said, gee, what's the best deal we can make with Excel now? No, that you'd have to pop back out. But I think you'd want to do that anyway, because if you're really going to try to abandon the effort, I think that's where you want to have the public conversation about abandoning it, and then see where that leads you. I said this last time, and I'll stick to it. I think, even though it was definitely awkward, I think the work the council did negotiating with Excel was important at the time we did it, because I don't think those negotiations would have happened otherwise. So it was critical, and I think the outcomes of those negotiations were critical for the community and, frankly, the PUC to see. But that was then, and I don't think that's going to repeat in the same way. So I don't think this really ties the future council's hands in terms of everything up to and including, gee, this isn't working. We need to come back out publicly and talk about why we think this isn't working, and have a conversation about what the next steps might be. And if that eventually led to some negotiations with Excel about what would a good deal look like, you might have to go back to the community to talk about how that would work. But that's several steps down the line, and I don't think it needs to be resolved in this ballot issue.
So just to confirm what you're saying, you think the intent back a few years ago was to explore this or explore an off-ramp. And you're saying now that we went down that path, it didn't work, that you don't think an off-ramp will ever be a...
No. Let's define off-ramp. There's different types.
Okay.
The off-ramps, in the sense of we don't think this is going to work, don't go away. That is always something council can discuss, both in executive session, if it's a legal matter.
But an off-ramp just, in that case, just means we have to stop it.
But what was different previously was, I think there was some understanding that the council might have a conversation with Excel about alternative approaches. I think since we're going back to the public to ask them, do they want to continue with the muni, knowing what they now know, which is a lot more than they knew before, I think it would be inappropriate for council to all of a sudden start talking with Excel or anybody about some other settlement discussions that would not include creating a muni that your voters just voted for quite explicitly.
Right.
So that, to me, is the difference.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to try and bring a little clarity to the off-ramps concept. In 2011, charter, the muni tax was approved, charter language was put in, and the charter language said, and I think these were added later, right? The four off-ramps that said rates will be equal to or better on day one, and those came 2 years later. But so rates will be equal to or better on day one. you have a plan for emissions reduction, reliability will be the same, and whatever the fourth.
Better.
So these were charter metrics that were
Debt.
required, and debt coverage ratio, right? So those four things had to be met and approved by a third-party reviewer. If that happened, then council could approve the formation of the utility, and so those were kind of gates. That utility formation happened in 2014. So even though that language is still in the charter, we did a test against those four off-ramps, found that we thought we would be good, and then council formed a utility. So in a sense, those off-ramps are no longer available for us to need to take unless the Supreme Court sends us back and supports the appeals court ruling that had come and said you didn't meet your off-ramps. But right now, the next thing we're going to talk about, 178, is going to be addressing exactly that issue of off-ramps. And so they're more tests of, can you meet this as a third party looks at it, rather than options for council to say, we're going to negotiate one of those off-ramps with Excel. So I just wanted to, does anyone disagree with that interpretation of off-ramp?
Well, slightly, because again, I think there are other things that would cause council to have some pause, assuming this process continues. Again, there could be some legal advice that says something very unexpected and really bad happened. I mean, let's say, I'm just really making
Don't even give an example. We know what you mean.
No, I will give one example, because it popped in my mind. I mean, if we ever do get the condemnation.
Because here we go.
And if we ever get the condemnation, and, there are some rulings about what you have to pay for or what you don't have to pay for that are contrary to what we expect, that would be legal advice and strategy that council would have to really seriously consider about, well, is that one step too far?
But nonetheless, we still wouldn't make any decisions.
No,
in
of
executive
course not.
session. We could hear about what the implication of the condemnation court ruling was, as far as what the costs would be.
Correct.
And then we would probably want to come public with the analysis.
But the key thing is, you could have that conversation and the legal advice about that in an executive session, and then try to figure out what the next steps are. So if you're not precluded from doing that with this.
The one thing in this thing that I still question is, it says may not include legal advice or negotiation strategy. I totally get people don't want us to negotiate a franchise or termination efforts in executive session, and I'm fine with that. When it says we may not include legal advice, does that mean we can't give it or get it? Now, because I think the idea for us to ask questions of our lawyers about things is a strange thing to include in that.
But it's only relative to the franchise.
Or
anything that would terminate.
Anything that would terminate it, correct.
Well, right, and anyhow, so I'm not done quite. Right, so to me, that's just a strange thing to include, because I presume asking questions of lawyers isn't something that's a problem. It's us negotiating. That's the issue. So I'll just throw that into the mix. I kind of think that's an interesting construct. Now you can go.
Thank you. Well, so I'm guessing, Mary, that you support something similar like this. Can I ask you that question? Because I'm interested in hearing from you before.
Yeah, I would support it. And, I mean, I guess I'll just go ahead
Please,
and speak if you don't mind.
Please. I did that a little wrong. I'd love to hear from you, Mary. Tell us your thoughts.
So, and then we'll decide what we're doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Erin. I'd love that you'd love to hear from me. So what I'm thinking is that the passage of this executive session, whenever it passed in, 2014 was it, 2013? I don't recall. But the passage of it, in any case, was a really, really, really real departure from how we do things. This was an exception that the community made that I don't think the community took lightly, and we did not take lightly in putting it out there for the voters to vote on. So if the community is feeling uncomfortable with how things have proceeded and proposing this language that Sam has proposed. And it can make the difference between it passing and not. And I want to support it. And I like the language. I think it's a good addition, and yeah.
So were you going to make a proposal?
Yeah, so, thank you, Mary. And so my guess is that there's majority council support for taking an approach, basically what Sam outlined. And David, can I just ask one more question on this language? So, we wouldn't be able to obtain advice or negotiation strategy under this language related to those matters, right, the settlement matters. But would, and not that I have any intention of doing this, I'm just trying to preserve flexibility for future councils. Would someone be able to say, hey, look, guys, I'm interested in having a public discussion of negotiating with Excel, just so that the topic could be broached by a council member, not advised about or negotiate the strategy, but at least that someone could say that, so that could signal an intention for some future public meeting.
Yeah, I think that would be okay.
Okay.
Because it doesn't sound like that type of a statement would, one, constitute legal advice, or two, really be a discussion of any type of negotiating strategy. It's really pushing requesting that a process be started.
Thank you. And again, having no personal intention of doing such a thing anytime remotely soon, given that to me gives enough flexibility for future councils that I can say, look, I would propose just moving forward with this, given the majority support.
Yeah. And thanks, Sam, for wordsmithing. So would you care to make a motion?
Sure, I move that we, well, no, let me look at my packet so I get it right.
Can I ask a question? Are we making a motion to vote on this, or are we making a motion to move this forward to the next meeting where the entire council can vote on it?
Second.
Second, okay.
Yeah, let me get it.
And it would be amended.
Right, as amended.
And then it would be re-presented to the council at the next meeting.
Right. If you think this is a bad idea, don't vote for it, but if you think it should be in the mix, you should.
All right, so I move to pass as amended on second reading and with the further amendments that are on the screen. Ordinance 8194, submitting to the electors of the city of Boulder at the regular municipal meeting to be held Tuesday, November 7, 2017, the question of whether to amend Section 9 of the Boulder Home Rule Charter to extend the authority to hold executive sessions until December 31st, 2023, setting forth the ballot title, specifying the form of the ballot and related details.
Second. Have we said what needs to be said?
Is the ballot, I'm looking at 8194, and so David, I didn't look at this before. So 8194 in our packet, which is the one that is basically like this, that says you can't have advice on franchises. If you look at the ballot question, the ballot title, it still says prohibit any discussions about negotiating a franchise unless there was public notice that such discussions would be included. So that's not right.
That's not right.
So that needs to maybe that was just copied from the other one.
Yeah.
So that needs to be
and
fixed.
Fixing the title.
Yeah, and it's in the title, which isn't so great. So that needs to be fixed, and you could either, I don't know, you could fix it any way you want to. You could include some of the words from this, but it needs to be fixed one way or the other.
Do we need to specify those words here? Or can we
I think we
give
can say it
discretion
needs
to
to be
David here?
fixed.
And I do think, some words that adequately convey the intentions of this.
Yeah. Is that enough, David, or?
Yeah, I think that really all you would have to do is strike everything after unless to the semicolon and then insert the language from the last clause of this.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yep.
Okay, I'm not following, but where's the unless?
Page.
So it would say prohibit any discussions about negotiating a franchise or other settlement
Settlement
discussions that would terminate Boulder's effort to operate an independent municipal electric utility. It's on the top of page 433.
43.
Oh, I thought it was 431.
31.
Oh, well, okay, you'd also have to fix the title on top of page 431.
You would. That's actually our ordinance, and so that would have to be changed when it comes back for the next reading. But I assume they would do that.
Well, they did it
What
wrong
what really matters is what's in the ballot title.
Okay, so.
Yeah, and just reading the ordinance title, I think it's sufficiently broad to cover this.
Okay, so it's just the one on,
Wait, the ordinance title,
I get it.
You remember, the ordinance title isn't going on the ballot.
Right.
That's just.
And it's addressed there to restrict the purpose of executive sessions.
okay,
Right.
So that's pretty broad language.
gotcha.
So good catch, Matt.
Okay, with that,
So moved, seconded, amended.
amended. Shall we vote?
Yeah.
All those in favor? Unanimous, begrudgingly unanimous. Okay, the third one,
Collaboratively?
collaboratively.
Begrudgingly.
Can I just say, I'm confused about this one. Is this a ballot measure, or do we decide this?
It would be a ballot measure.
It's a ballot
okay.
measure.
It's a charter change.
Okay.
Okay. You know what, in the end, okay, you know what? We're going to end up having you go back to Sam's language yet again. Okay. Why don't you just go ahead and pitch your language?
Okay, just for people who are watching, this measure would refer a charter amendment to the voters, and it would establish the utility if passed by the voters. And what had happened before was council established the utilities. That's what's been challenged in court. So if the people voted to pass this, I believe it would extinguish that court case effectively. And it also promises a future vote, right? That's how I understand this measure, is it promises a future vote before we can bond, right? So bonding authority is not given for separation unless there's a vote of the public. So that is that about right?
Yep. The utility's formed, but we can't go out for debt until it goes back to the voters. And if I might just say one thing, so the way that Charter Section 178A is now set up, and this is my interpretation of it, is that it's set up, I think it's designed to be set up with a bunch of checks and balances to make sure that we don't move into this next step lightly. I think that what this is being replaced with is kind of the ultimate check and balance when you actually ask the voters to approve that next step.
Right. And so what I would point out, however, is that when it does remove those charter requirements, those checks and balances, which we have, heard from a third-party authority that we've already qualified for, it removes what people perceive as the off-ramps in the charter. And so I guess the reason that I propose this language, and actually have stronger language if we need to go there, is that this guarantees that that check and balance that David described, the voters being able to vote, is well informed, so that we commit the city.
Can you page down?
Sure.
We commit the city effectively to providing information on all these subjects.
Oh.
Right.
You got my ideas up there too.
Yeah, David took all that out.
Yeah.
So David, talk to me about why the data provision requirement's a bad idea.
Well, I think the primary reason is that, and this is probably abundant legal caution, so I'll admit that. But one of the things that we learned from the initial adoption of 178A is that when we added a lot of tasks we added a lot of opportunities for people to say that we didn't do it right. And the language that you have in here is another list of things that potentially somebody will argue that we didn't do it right. And of course, the original 178A was drafted with great intentions. The result has been, 4 years of litigation, and we're looking at it. So, like I said, is it fatal? No. Would I advise it? Probably not either, and I probably wouldn't advise it just based on the fact that we're dealing with an opponent that understands the value of delay.
Okay, I get that, and I'll just ask one follow-up question. Are there not lawyer words that you can put into this that make things like best available data, which I tried lawyer words, but clearly I'm not good at them, but something that hedges us against, now, your top line advice is probably right, okay? If you were going to try and make this better, how would you do it? And this is not a lay down on the tracks issue for me. It was an attempt to show voters who are going to look at this that we will be trying to provide them the best information possible so they can make their decision.
And specifically on the four issues.
On the four issues that they cared about. So it was not to have any requirements that we perform at any level relative to those issues. It was just that they have information about them so they can vote.
Well, I guess we could come up with some ideas. My primary concern would be to putting it in the charter and really kind of create another vulnerability that we're trying to get rid of by this change in the first place. There are probably other places that we could put something like this. We could put it in the uncodified portion of the ordinance as legislative intent. We could consider what it might look like if we were actually to put it in the utility ordinance that's in Title 11 of our code right now. So there's some other places where we could put it. But yeah, I would be a little concerned about kind of the sanctity of when something is voter approved in the charter.
So, but the idea of putting it somewhere else as intent.
Yeah, that would be my preference. So, we could add, we have, add a new section 5 and renumber everything in this ordinance and add this language where it actually says, as a legislative matter of the council, what we're going to do as opposed to a voter-approved requirement.
Got it. And so that reduces our risk significantly?
I think it would, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's always something, then if it is a problem, the council would be able to amend it. In the charter, you can't.
I concur with that. Sorry.
No, you can say that, and then Mary's in the queue.
Wouldn't we want to present that information prior to a vote anyway? I mean, voters aren't going to make a decision in a vacuum, so you would have to do it whether or not it's codified anywhere. Nobody's going to vote for something if they don't have any information, so you would have to do it no matter what.
Right.
There's have to and have to.
This was an attempt to preserve the concept that those 4 off-ramp criteria and charter would be something that we would, so I expect we'll want to show a lot more, like what's the total, debt and the cash flow over 30 years and all that.
So I think that intention to make darn clear, hey, and those metrics we talked about, we'll show you how we measure to them, makes sense to include legislatively.
Okay, so if you guys are inclined to carry this forward tonight, we could add a new section 5, renumber the remaining accordingly, add this language into the ordinance part of this.
Okay, so just so we're clear, which packet page is?
I'm on packet page 439.
Yep.
439.
It's right after the ballot title, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah, ballot title, ballot question. It gets very confusing. I also have a question about wording. This whole notion of incur indebtedness, Why can't we just say incur debt?
You could.
Your words.
Can't we, again, the closer we can get to lay people's language or English, well, I think the better. Indebtedness?
You could just say incurred debt.
Don't you guys think that would be a little clearer?
I'm always for
It's
making
shorter.
everything-
Shorter.
Shorter is better.
Okay, where's the?
So,
Okay,
And can I ask a question?
Yes.
About later, David, just to clarify that, I mean, specifically what we'll be putting out on the ballot is that we can't incur debt.
Yep.
Right, but effectively what that means is that we couldn't operate a municipal electric utility, right? Because it's infeasible to operate one without incurring debt.
Yep.
So so it's just kind of worth getting out there. The language will just be about, can we take on debt? But the effect will be, can we actually do it?
Right, because the enterprise can't incur debt.
Yep.
So David,
That's what that means.
while we're getting nervous about words, and I agree with the moving the data stuff, that worried me too. The original wording, and I don't know if this is a difference without a distinction, but the original wording says incurred debt for construction to separate.
Right.
And this doesn't. And honestly, I don't know if that matters or not, and that's a question. I mean, is to separate from the existing utility system absolutely positively clear, so that, again, somebody couldn't go after us and say, well, that's vague, that's unclear, that's got multiple meetings, that's who knows what.
Well, I was concerned for construction, because there will be other things we have to pay for out of that debt. I think not just separation, but, services for people to design. And so I'm like you, Matt, I'm very unclear on how to phrase it in the most bulletproof way.
I am. I mean, so really my question isn't so much about the for construction. It's does the term to separate from the existing utility system have a sufficiently clear and unambiguous meaning that it can't be construed in some other weird way?
Well, what about to say to separate from the existing utility system to operate a municipal utility system to provide electricity?
Well, that's to provide electricity to customers within the city.
Well, no, but the part about we can't separate or operate, right?
Right.
If indeed that's the right.
Do we want to communicate the concerns to our legal staff and have them maybe think about alternate
Yes.
language that address those
Yes,
concerns?
I don't have word
No,
ideas.
let's wordsmith.
It was really just a question. And while you're doing that, by the way.
It's a fair concern, but
Just as last time, in the ballot title, if we're going to change this wording, the ballot title language should sync up with the wording we have here, however that ends up.
Yep.
They just need to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Well, and I think that the language is intentional in terms of, because that's the next big step. I think that if it gets too broad, there has been some talk with our financial advisors that there may be other opportunities to, use debt to, just to help us forward. So, and I don't think that we haven't really identified those yet, but I think that there is some attempt here to be clear about what we're talking about, and really that debt is, the next big debt, the construction to separate, that's where you're really starting to spend money in a big way.
And there's nothing else, whether it's condemnation or nothing else. We're not being too narrow here.
Well, I think that the separation part of the process, we've set up the, dare I say, no-go point in time.
The voter community approval
there you go, approach to it. And really that, at that point, that's when we're really certain to say, okay, once we have that approved, then we're ready to really start to think about how this is going to work, in terms of borrowing money to spend for the separation of the system.
Could they, meaning an opponent who wanted to stop this, could they use this narrow construction to stop us from paying a condemnation award?
Well, I think that it's intended to, actually. So I think that in terms of how the process is laid out is that last step is we're going to get a condemnation, a decision in condemnation in terms of what the value of the assets are. So then the next step is, how are we going to pay for it? And that's when we would take that number to the voters. So I think it's intended to do just that. And the next step is...
We wouldn't acquire the system without a no-go, a go, no vote.
So David, then, isn't it really more...
So it's not construction,
and I think we
acquisition.
agree on this. I mean, isn't it really more general that we're saying that before the city can provide electricity to customers within the city, it has to go to a vote of the people to incur debt. But the debt really could be for any number of things. And it, in some sense, it almost doesn't matter what the debt's for, because you can't create the utility system to, quote, provide electricity to customers within the city without incurring debt at some point along the line, and the voters would have to weigh in, which is the whole intent of this, is the voters get the final say.
Right, so it seems to me, because we're just doing a tax measure where we're going to, just so it's not confusing, before we do the big expenditure to acquire or do construction, we're going to the voters.
That's correct.
So maybe we should say for acquisition or construction.
And acquisition and startup costs. I mean, I personally would broaden this, because this is the big, isn't this the one where we're going for the final community voter approval?
So the question
and so it would include, hopefully, our estimates of at least condemnation and separation.
So do you broaden it by listing things which, if I were a lawyer, I'd worry about, because you forget something?
Yep.
Or do you broaden it by saying it's debt so that the utility system can provide electricity to customers within the city?
To start and operate the utility system.
And whatever that debt turns out to be for, including things maybe we haven't thought about right at the moment.
So Matt, you're saying debt to provide electricity to customers within the city?
Yeah, to allow
That
us
would
to
be
do that.
like as broadest, I
Right.
think that makes sense.
So before...
Well, it's a David question.
Okay.
There's some feedback.
Let's hear from you, and then,
Yeah.
do you want?
So actually, I would like to ask Heather Bailey to come up and respond. She's been much more involved in kind of the financial planning for getting this up and running, and I'm guessing that she has some opinions on how this should be worded.
Thank you, David. Actually, I think the way it was worded is actually the right way, and I'll tell you why.
Which way are you?
About to incur debt for construction to separate from the existing system, because that's actually the first thing we have to do. And my concern is if we start broadening up a vote for every time for issuing debt, there are all sorts of things that we will be potentially financing, but we won't finance probably anything until we separate. And so to me, the big no-go decision, and first of all, if we have to issue debt for separation, those won't be bonds of the utility until we form the utility several years later. So you, and Bob, you can come up and give me all the corrections on the Tabor stuff, but because they will be general obligation bonds, you'd have to have a vote anyhow. And so what I guess to me, you're putting belt and suspenders on something you would have to do no matter what, because if the council decided to move forward at the go, no-go point. And again, at the go, no-go point, we would have the condemnation and the separation decision, the condemnation decision from the court, so we know how much the system costs. And remember, we have a provision on that that limits the acquisition to $214 million, acquisition plus stranded costs if we pay for it all at once to $214 million. So you've already got the limit on that. You also have the issue, so we have that information, council makes a go decision. The next thing we would have to do would pay for the separation, and that's the construction, and that's a big decision, and that's a lot of money. And so what I see this saying is that in order to move forward at the go, no-go point and issue debt for construction, we need to go to the voters, which if we issue GO bonds, we'd have to do that anyhow. Now, where I start to get a little bit anxious is that to someone's point is we don't know what all we would need to borrow or not borrow or where we'll get funds for, say, organizational costs or startup costs. So say 18 months from the day we do cutover, we'll need to bring in maybe buy equipment, buildings, put in systems, that sort of thing. We don't know if we'll issue debt for that. We don't know if we would have a conventional loan. So there's a whole host of ways that could be done. And so my concern is if we need to go to a vote for that, first of all, we don't know today, and I don't even know if we'll know at the go, no-go decision how we're going to do that. And it may be we have enough money to fund it out of the general fund. We don't know. My point is,
Keep it narrow to construction.
keep it to that, because then you get to the cutover day, and the cutover day is when we issue the debt of the utility, which is the enterprise. And that's where you issue the debt to pay the condemnation award that we got prior to the go, no-go decision. And so it gets really complicated. And to me, the tightest control you can have at this point is the voters have to decide whether we want to spend the money at the go, no-go decision to do the construction of the separation plan. Because if the voters say yes, they've agreed to spend the money and we're in. If they say no, then we don't go any further than that.
So I think you've convinced us. Is everybody convinced? We have a question.
I have a question. Thanks for that explanation, Heather. So does this impose an additional requirement beyond the Tabor requirement that we go to the voters to issue debt?
I don't think so. Bob?
Well, I think that it could be interpreted two ways. One, if we were to do, and a lot of this goes to financial practicality, but you could just say, you could just have a ballot measure that says, shall the city be able to issue revenue bonds, right? And then we would go through our normal revenue bonding authority, and we would issue revenue bonds, and it would be based on what we think the revenues will be generated by the utility. That's one approach. The other approach is that if you get into the area that Heather was explaining, the general obligation debt, if we were going into general obligation debt, then you actually have to have Tabor authority to take that kind of debt on. So it could be done a variety of ways, all of which, under this language, requires at least one voter approval.
Okay. Do you have another question?
No, I just had a response to that answer.
Oh, I'm ready to move us forward. But you have an extra 2 in there.
Yeah, you have an extra 2 in there right before the 4.
Incurred debt 2, 4.
So how do you want to move us forward?
Well, can I address this actually before you do that?
Okay.
Because actually that causes an additional concern for me. It makes me fine with the language, but it's sounding like that as it's structured that we could have an election about a bond issue that just said, shall we issue bonds, that would satisfy this clause. And I was imagining this clause as being more of we would have at some point a ballot initiative that said, hey, voters, do you want to do the utility? And this is...
As opposed to, do you want to, are we cool to issue bonds to start a utility?
Yeah, and there's kind of a fine distinction in here. So the language in 178 about actually forming the utility, we're asking the voters to form the utility at the next election,
Absolutely.
provided that it goes forward.
Right.
This question here is really, do you want us to operate a utility? And it gets to that notion of taking the step from separate construction and separation to actual operation. That's where that's kind of the next step in the check and balance.
Okay. And I guess the one thing that it would provide something additional about is that if we found some way to issue bonds that were not Tabor required, to have a voter approval, then this would prevent us from doing that. Anyway, okay, I guess I'm all right.
So I'm still, yeah.
Okay.
I'm still concerned, but we have time to think about it. So one of the things about moving it forward is we can go chew over this language and how it interacts with other things, because what I'm hearing and what I thought I heard Aaron maybe say is that if we end up, we could start separation. This gets approved, community voter approval vote happens, and we go ahead, and so we issue bonds for separation, okay? We get partway through the separation process, and then we have to go out for general obligation bonds. It's another opportunity for us to have put a lot of money into something and then not go forward with it. So it seems to me that this is giving voters the possibility of 2 more votes, and I support 1 for sure. But I think when we cross the Rubicon, we're going to have to be across the Rubicon. So I just didn't want to, let me finish my last thought. I just didn't want to make this so narrow that if we cross the Rubicon, that we could end up not being able to complete. So I'll let.
Okay, so that's a fine point. So the intent of this is to be the one big vote when we know the answers to say, are you guys in or not?
Yes.
Right.
So that's what we want this to be. Let's pass this as is and have the discussion with people about whether we've accomplished that with this.
Right, and I've got and Heather, you can come back to us with this, and maybe this is going too far. It's kind of a little bit along the lines of Sam's, but, this is in the charter, so you go to the voters, they approve debt for construction to separate from the existing utility system, blah, blah, blah. You discover that you need a little bit more money, or we expand the system someday because we annex some more property, and so we're separating some additional from the utility system, and we're incurring debt to do that. This would say you'd have to go back to the voters each time, which is clearly not the intent. So think about that. We're all thinking about this as a one-time, and that's certainly the right way to think about it. But remember, it stays in the charter. It doesn't go away. And you don't want it to come back and nail you again on something that you thought you dealt with. So think about if that's a problem, because it might be.
Okay. So let's pass this thing with the caveat that we're not sure we've got it all. To my understanding, it's this plus taking the strikeout language in red and adding it into the legislative section, correct?
That's correct.
And then making sure the title reflects, is in sync.
Sync, that's all.
Okay, so that's, can we just make
So
a
moved.
motion? So moved? All right, second, okay. We done discussing? We good?
So just one kind of housekeeping item. For the legislative section, if we could say, prior to the election required by Charter Section 178, comma, the city will provide.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that good? Okay, all those in favor? It is unanimous. All righty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last public hearing.
Now Heather goes back and gets ready for the PC.
Motion to adopt ordinance 8188, annexing 752 Gapter Road.
Okay, and you can take mine down and set it over to 3-4.
Let's see how quickly.
What's that?
Well, we still have 2 more after this. I forgot about that. And then pull-up and,
Probably quick ones after this.
Morning, Chris.
okay. Go, Chris, go.
Well, good evening. I'm going to make this fairly quick in terms of presentation. I'm happy to elaborate if we need to, but this is a public hearing for the annexation of 752 Gapter Road. This property is located on the eastern edge of the city, just north of Baseline Road, where it intersects just west of Cherryvale. And the land use for this property is very low density residential, and the property would annex consistent with the zoning of the surrounding properties of rural residential 2. In the staff memorandum, there are findings related to compliance, and we find that it is consistent with state statutes, the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, as well as initial zoning that is consistent with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan land use designation. So with that, we recommend adoption of Ordinance 8188, annexing the property at 752 Gapter Road.
Great. Any questions of Chris?
Yeah, one simple one. So Chris, somewhere in the memo, if I remember correctly, it said this is the last property that will qualify for the special deal, although I don't know that everybody is annexed at this point. So is it literally the last property that qualifies for the special deal?
It is. This is the last property that is being processed under the special incentive package that council authorized as a part of the 2013 flood recovery efforts. And part of why it's the last one is it's trailing behind is there were some others that were trying to decide whether they were going to annex or not, and they chose not to, so this is the last one.
Okay, so anybody after this who, in that area that chooses to annex, it's back to our regular rules, I guess I'd put it that way.
Correct, and the biggest change of that is obviously the application fee itself.
Right, okay.
Okay. Do we have anyone signed up to speak to this?
And I will just note, the property owners are not here, but obviously are excited about being able to connect to city utilities.
Excellent. Okay, we will close the public hearing. Aaron?
I've got a motion. I move we adopt Ordinance 8188, annexing .8 acres of land generally located at 752 Gapter Road with an initial zoning classification of residential rural 2.
Second. Oh, who wants it? Go ahead, Jan.
It's a roll call vote. Oh, you can speak to your motion.
I think it's great.
Great.
It was a good program that we had to respond to the flood.
Cool.
We'll start with Councilmember Young.
Whoa, that never happens. Aye.
Applebaum.
Aye.
Brockett.
Aye.
Burton. Aye. Jones.
Aye.
Weaver.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. We have a matter. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I got to find it.
There's always this.
Consideration of a motion to appoint 2 council members to the Open Space and Mountain Parks Master Plan Process Committee.
Oh, that's you. Tanya.
Information's in your packet, and the request is for council to appoint 2 members to the Open Space Mountain Parks Master Plan Process Committee. It will be 2 members of council and 2 members of the OSMP board. Meetings at this point are planned from August of 2017 through 19. 1 hour a month is the approximate commitment time.
Do we have appointees from the OSBT yet?
Yes.
And was that in our packet and I missed it?
Yep.
Okay, who are they?
It's Kurt Brown and Tom Volkhausen. Do I have that right?
Not Tom Volkhausen.
No?
He's not on.
Tom Isaacson.
No.
Tom Isaacson.
Isaacson. Phew,
Yeah,
wrong
I was
Tom.
like,
Sorry.
wow. Okay, and I think the one, if I understand correctly, we said this process is going to go for 2 years, yeah, at least? And there was some discussion of maybe after the election, we'd want to throw this back into the bundle of committee assignments, just, I don't think it's a given that we'd want to change things, but that we'd be open to changing things. And I think 4 people threw their names in the hat. Is that correct? Okay, anybody want to speak, before we speak about individuals, anybody want to speak to the notion of this? I know Matt does, so that's why.
Yeah, I do, really briefly. I just tell you, I've had concerns about appointing council members to all sorts of committees. This one really doesn't concern me. It's more where council members are appointed to committees that are made up of members of the public. And it's mostly because council members get deferred to whether they want to or not. And I think we're often not very clear about what the council member's role should be, whether the person should actually vote on things, take an active role, take a kind of backseat role. And frankly, I think there are examples where that hasn't worked out very well. These committees, though, which is kind of more of an internal committee, where you've got a couple of council members and you've got some board members and you've got some staff. Those are, I don't know if I always like them, but those at least tend to take care of themselves a lot better. You have a lot more kind of equal footing, as it were. The only two things I would say that I don't think we're very careful about often on council is I'd really like to see everybody get a shot at these. We often have people who serve on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these, and it would be really nice if we spread it around as we do all of our committees. And secondly, we should not be shy about talking about politics, because it is important on some of these committees that if you're going to appoint 2 council members, which you should do, not 1, that they actually have somewhat different views on stuff. Even if it's just a process committee, it matters. And we tend not to do that because we very much support each other. But, sometimes you need to talk about that. So this committee, because it's set up with frequent check-ins back with council, so that's great. It's set up to be with board members from open space, that's great. It's set up with 2 council members, that's great. So I think what's left is, can we get some council members on this who haven't served in the last couple of years on several committees, and B, insofar as you can tell, have somewhat different perspectives on where open space might go in the future. And those would be my concerns. Obviously, I am not in the running, so, not my problem in that sense, but I think to have a successful committee, that's what you want. Whether the next council wants to reopen it, that's up to the next council. Given how long-running this is, and that's really unusual for a committee, I can't think of one that has gone this long, it might be wise at some point, maybe after a year, to do a swap out, just because you could get some new ideas, some new thoughts, get somebody else, especially a new council member, involved in it. That wouldn't be a bad idea, but that's up to the next council. So, and we're missing 3 people tonight, which is a little bit awkward, including some people who've thrown their hat in the ring. So that's
I got a great idea, let's punt.
But we could vote it. But
okay.
If you ask me to vote, that's my criteria.
That's hopeful. Thank you. Does anybody want to else speak to criteria?
No, I'll just real quickly agree that with Matt about having 2 council members with varying opinions. I think makes complete sense.
Well, I just didn't get to say it earlier, so I agree with Matt.
Wow, this is your lucky night.
I must be doing something wrong tonight.
I was going to say you have, never mind. Okay, so let's just figure this out.
Okay, so who of the 4 people that threw their hat in the ring?
Name in the hat?
Yeah.
Oh, the hat in the
whatever.
ring, that's right.
Yeah, hat and ring. Okay, ring in the hat. Have not served on committees recently.
Well, my
not.
comp plan process committee ended, so that was part of why I threw my hat in the ring, is because that was something I was doing for a while with Sam. I thought it went very well, but I'm down to just 3 committees at this point, so I thought
You needed another one.
I kind of need another one.
Well, I would just say I see these as a little different than the normal committees that we serve on, kind of the standing committees that we serve on. These are kind of ad hoc. I will agree, this one is a little odd just because it's so long running. Usually these things are a few months.
So housing was one that was not determined at the beginning of the year, it was set up later. Was the Boulder Valley Comp Plan decided at the beginning of the year when we all divided up things, or was that decided later too?
No, that was in the heat of the moment, I think.
Right, that was later.
So
When we needed,
Yeah, that was
we
later.
decided that we wanted council members on the process committee.
Okay.
So, and I agree with Matt, these are different. These are, like the process committee, there's no substance.
Well, there shouldn't be.
There shouldn't, well.
I mean, that's substance in the sense of merit of issues.
Okay, all right, you're talking too much. Right. You know what I mean? That's how they build it, was no substance. And the idea it's process. So the way I was just kind of saying is, I haven't been on one of these process committees, so I was going to, I threw my name in the hat. I'm not wedded to it. I know that Lisa's was on the public participation process. You guys were on the comp plan process. I don't know if you.
I was in the housing and the middle income strategy. Well, no, that was the strategy itself. So it wasn't a process committee, but I was in the housing process.
And so was Lisa.
No, that was the middle income strategy. That was different. It wasn't a process committee. It was a substantive.
It is kind of weird to be deciding this without 3 people here. Not wanting to punt. You're waiting to schedule meetings for us to hurry up and decide this, though.
In August.
It is August.
It is August.
It is August.
Well, why don't we decide, and then they can schedule meetings, and then we can make changes if we need to.
Look, I'm not shy. I would, Suzanne, I'd put you and Aaron on it, and just based on what I said, I mean, normally the mayor, having been there, tends to stay out of this stuff because you figure the mayor has enough other stuff to do, and also, but I don't think it's bad to do it once in a while, and you haven't done any of this stuff in forever. And it's also a process committee, which is rather different than some of the other committees we're on. So I think you'd be a good choice on this, and I think in terms of my perception of some views on open space and where it's going, of the people who've applied, I think Aaron would be a good counterpart, because I think you have a different, it's not so much you have a different view of where open space is going, you just have different relationships with people. And I think for a process committee, that's a good thing. But I think other solutions are fine too. But that would be the one I would shoot for. For this one, I also think, I mean, Aaron's done one thing, but otherwise hasn't been involved in the ongoing suite of committees of these kind of ad hoc things.
Yeah, I understand.
You know, again, ad hoc stuff is different than the long-standing things.
I would support that recommendation.
So I would just like to put a plug in. One of the things that I think it was Jean who made the presentation. Was it Jean that made the presentation about this committee? And she was no, it was Darren Wagner, who made the presentation. She talked about reaching out to folks that don't get reached out to. And I try to do that. And I have relationships with community members that oftentimes don't get reached out to. So I think I bring that to the table. And I guess I would also add that I don't see, when it comes to open space, I don't see Suzanne and Aaron's views as so divergent.
Oh.
Are we like this, or are we like this?
So that's...
So, I mean, I generally agree with Mary, and that's not a value judgment on anyone. I mean, when it came to, for example, the North Sky Trail, Suzanne and I voted for it, Lisa and Mary voted against it. So I would use that as an example in which I think Mary and Lisa both sit a little further outside the median that is the middle of council. So I would propose that we keep the names in the hat and punt and make sure that we have a full council here to make this decision. That's my thought. But, I mean, I guess I think everybody would do a good job. It's just about balancing the right points of view. So if it were me, I would think of Mary and Lisa as being kind of in one spot on the views of open space. And I wouldn't say that you, Aaron, and Suzanne are exactly at the same spot either, but you're also, by votes, not exactly where Mary and Lisa are. So that being said, I'm uncomfortable with these kinds of appointments.
We're all kind of awkward up here.
Yeah, that's the problem. It is very difficult.
It is. What is this? This is the first, our next opportunity.
Well, so staff can go ahead and schedule the meetings, and then all four of us can show up, and it's going to be noticed anyway. That's what we did, though, with the middle income strategy.
Great idea.
Okay, let's punt, go ahead and schedule the meeting. And, and I think there's plenty of good combinations of the people that have their name in the hat, so.
That's correct. I think
So I think we can figure it out. I also think, well, we'll just leave it there. Okay. All right. Last item, call-up.
Call-up. As I stated earlier, this is the first project that's coming down the pike with the form-based code. And already we see, 6 exceptions, 2 of which, the length of the building and the access point, are, in my view, have huge impacts on the pedestrian aspect of a project. I can think of one project that I was on planning board when it happened, which is the Jewish Community Center out on East Arapahoe, that has, on a main road or on the street-facing portion of the building, has an access point, and that just really kills the pedestrian, the walkability aspect of a building. So that's one thing. And then the length, too. So if we start to give exceptions right away and don't challenge folks to look at, to try and come up with solutions that are better, we just, right off the bat, we're giving up, in my view, why we did form-based code in the first place.
Can I ask a question about that? My understanding was that the requested changes were based on the fact that it was well through the planning process before we passed form-based code. So my question would be, how many of those special requests were due to the fact that it wasn't yet in place when they started the process? Do we know that answer?
We can ask Andy.
Yeah, and we might as well let you.
I'll just be here. I'll just answer any questions. I won't try to expand.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Andy Bush. I live at 2345 Bluff Street, Boulder, Colorado, and I'm the developer of 3200 Bluff. The 2 exceptions that were requested, one was the access off a Type A street. It's the only place to actually get access for that as part of it, and I don't think it was really conceived of as part of this district when we first thought about it. The only other way to do it would have been to create an alley all the way behind the building, because we're on a triangular site on a ditch, and we actually chose to preserve that as open space and create a really cool walkway and paseo down it. So it was one that staff supported and 5 out of the 6 planning board members supported. The building length, the overall intent was to create, to break up buildings and facades and make them in pedestrian scale. And even though the actual building length is 20 or 30 feet longer than that maximum, we actually broke the building up into a series of pieces and a series of different facades. And again, both staff and 5 out of 6 planning board members felt that the solution was really the right solution and meant the intent of the exceptions. The other thing is, when we did the form-based code, and we've been part of its creation, evolution, we created all the diagrams to actually judge it by. The idea was that to try and create good design and good outcomes, you should allow certain exceptions. comments, but filter those through staff and planning board, which we did. And again, 5 out of 6 planning board members felt that we met all those in terms of the exceptions we required. So that's at least how we got there. It wasn't that we were in place before form-based code and therefore we asked for exceptions. It was because of good design and trying to do the right thing in a triangular parcel that's actually kind of the exception instead of the rule. This was the right way to do it. So both staff supported it all the way through, and so did planning board with the exception of 1 member.
Okay, do other people want to speak to this? Aaron?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I don't feel the need to call this up. I mean, I think with the form-based code, the idea is that you get essentially what you've already anticipated in a project, and then you look at any exceptions that were asked for and say, do those rise to the level where you feel like you're really not getting what you expected, and you have to make wholesale changes. And it is a constrained site with the triangular shape of it. So, and while I do hate to see the turns in right off of the main street, in order to preserve open space in the back, I'd hate even more to see long driveways leading into a garage that impedes your ability to have functional open space. So I'm comfortable with the exceptions as granted by planning board.
Sam?
So I'm more where Mary is on this. I think actually what's really interesting about this triangular site, and I think the buildings are kind of interesting the way they fit in, so there was a lot of thought put in there. I think what we could do out of this process really has something to do with the site, but learn about how form-based codes and exceptions interact, using this as an example. And the fact that it's a constrained site is a good example because it will have probably more calls for exception. So I would do it just from the standpoint of, well, we haven't done this before. One of the functions of council is to be able to review call-ups and see if we think they're necessary. I agreed with Mary's principle that it would be good to review this from a planning perspective based simply on the exceptions and how the site interacted with them. So that's where I am. There's no judgment on the project in there, by the way.
Matt?
Yeah, I'm where Aaron is. Yeah, I think council should review how well form-based code is working, and I think this project could be one of the examples. But it doesn't have to be as part of a call-up. I mean, you do a call-up when you think there is some fundamental problem or some policy issue or something that really is exceptionally troubling. And I don't see that in this project. I'm not, frankly, a huge fan of form-based code. We'll see where it goes in the long run. But I think if you want good design, you're going to have some exceptions. Frankly, I think the constraints we put on things often gives us not so great design. I'd be a lot more troubled if, well, I did read the planning packet to some extent. And I think, the form-based code in this case kind of has some nice ideas, but they're not meant to apply precisely to every single site. And certainly the weird triangular site doesn't work very well for some of the form-based code ideas. But more importantly, you read what the staff says about it, and you look at the strong majority vote on planning board, and they certainly considered it, and they had some concerns, as they should have. So good for them for doing their job. But I think they did their job. And clearly 5 of them, 5 out of 6, because one person was recused, felt that these 2 exceptions were just perfectly reasonable within the broader design scheme and even within the goals of the form-based code. So it just doesn't rise to me to that level, but I do agree that after a few buildings are built with form-based code, there absolutely needs to be a review as to what worked, what didn't work, what could work better, how specific can you be or should you be with form-based code if your goal is really to try to create good design. Don't you need to, have some flexibility built into the system and frankly trust your design board and your and you're a planning board. In this case, I think they both did a good job. So I wouldn't call it up, but I would review it at some later point.
Sure.
And that is that we did, since we are kind of the guinea pig for this, we did tell planning board that we'd be glad to come back and do a planning board session just to review form-based code and the process and the good and the bad things as part of it. And that obviously would come back to council, and we're glad to do a presentation to council that's a summary after we do the feedback with planning board.
Thank you. Jan?
I would have to agree with Matt and Aaron on this one. And I trust, well, I'm not going to repeat the points they made. I agree completely. And I would add the other one, which is, I don't think we have extra time on the calendar. We've got a lot of things we've not been able to get to, like recommendations from the process committee, and we're looking at a special meeting for that. So I just think given all of our other priorities that we've got as a council, then I think that's more reason to defer to the planning board and staff and the design advisory board.
Just asking.
So, but if it's a tie, it doesn't go forward?
If it's a tie, it does not go forward. It takes a majority of a quorum to call an item up.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to say, my instinct is that the result's not going to be different if we wait till next meeting.
Well, and the call-up period runs the day before your next meeting, so your opportunity is tonight.
Okay.
Okay. I'll be honest, I don't feel strongly on this, other than I do think we put a lot of thought into embracing form-based code in order to solve what was a real outcry against the quality of buildings we were going to get, and I am very interested in seeing if it works. A session to call this up, you're about like, well, I was going to say you're very easy to deal with, and to me that would be a useful session. We don't have the votes for it, so it's not going to happen. Here's what I would say is, I think, well, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but taking you up on your offer to do a review of how it went and stuff, I think at a minimum we would be interested in.
We'd be glad to, with staff, pull the whole design team together and come in and do a debrief.
You have to speak in the mic.
We'd be glad to come back with staff and our design team and do a brief debrief at your convenience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay. All right, with that,
Suzanne,
Yes.
before we conclude, we do have a scheduling item. We polled council tonight for the special meeting on the 28th for PPWG. And just so we can follow up with the working group, wanted to understand if we're comfortable scheduling that meeting at this time.
well, except for that we are missing 2 people. The 16th doesn't work for 4 people, so that's out. The 28th works for everybody here. It was noted that we have a council meeting that week. We also have an executive session.
That's on my calendar.
Do we have an executive session the week of that 28th?
Not that I know of.
No?
I think we just
I don't think so.
have a council meeting. So it would be 2 meetings back to back. That is true. But we don't have 3. So interpreting this and the fact that we can't afford not to hear from the folks, and we don't have an empty enough meeting that we can guarantee no bumpage. So we thought we better just do a special meeting. Assuming Andrew and Bob, I mean, those are big assumptions. I think we should go to the 28th. We at least have 7 of us.
So for clarification, you're comfortable with scheduling it for the 28th?
I am. Does anybody disagree?
Okay.
Make it so.
Thank you.
Okay. Any debrief of this meeting?
It was messy on the municipalization stuff, but it's complicated. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for working through all of that, because the details were important, and I think we're honing in on it.
I agree. I appreciate your language because I think that helped it really clarify things, so. Okay, with that, we're adjourned.